The anchor breaks. The villain called himself Undertow, and he had already put 3 pro-heroes in the ground before Izuku Midoriya reached the collapsing pier. Rain came down in sheets, turning the boardwalk into a black mirror that threw back the strobing red of emergency lights. Izuku's quirk had manifested only 2 years ago, late even by the standards of the Quirkles turned Letta bloomer cases the doctors liked to write papers about, and he still did not have a name for it that satisfied him. The support course kids called it Temporal Anchor because that was the phrase stamped on his provisional license, but Izuku privately thought of it as something smaller and stranger. He could reach backward. Not far. Not on purpose, most days. A few seconds, sometimes a minute, enough to undo a killing blow or reset a hostage's collapsed lung. It was a quirk built for rescue, not glory, and that suited him. Undertow's power was different. He could seize a piece of the world, whatever the world happened to be doing at that moment, and thread it backward through the fabric of causality until the past bled into the present. He had used it to unmake a bridge support, to erase a hero's memory of the last 10 minutes, to make Izuku's own careful rescue work vanish as though it had never occurred. That was the part that frightened Izuku most, more than the collapsing pier or the screaming civilians. Undertow was not fighting him. Undertow was fighting the idea that anything Izuku did could last. "You want to fix things," Undertow said, standing in the wreckage with water sluicing off his coat, his voice carrying that particular flatness Izuku had learned to associate with villains who had stopped being frightened of dying. "I want to show you fixing is a lie. Everything unwinds eventually. I'm just faster about it." "You don't have to prove that on people," Izuku said. His hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, more from the cold and the accumulated static of holding his quirk half open for the last 20 minutes, ready to reach back the instant someone needed him to. "Let them go. This doesn't have to end with anyone else in the water." Undertow smiled, and that was the last mistake he made, because smiling meant he stopped watching Izuku's hands, and Izuku's hands were what mattered. Izuku surged forward through ankle-deep water, driving his shoulder into the villain's ribs, and for 1/2 second it worked exactly the way every rescue had worked before. Undertow's power responded instinctively, defensively, the way a hand snaps back from a flame. He tried to unwind the last 30 seconds and erase Izuku's charge before it landed. Their quirks met in the middle of that motion the way 2 waves meet, and neither of them cancelled out. They multiplied. Izuku had no memory of deciding to reach backward at that moment. His quirk simply answered the threat the only way it knew how, grabbing for anchor points in time the way a drowning man grabs for anything solid, and Undertow's unraveling power gave it far more rope than it had ever held before. What should have been a 2-second correction became something else entirely, a long silver thread stretching backward through years Izuku had never lived, snapping taut, and pulling him down its length like a hooked fish. The pier vanished. The rain vanished. The city's skyline, familiar since childhood, unspooled into something Izuku had only ever seen in grainy archive photographs, then something he had never seen at all. He tried to scream and found he had no air to scream with, no body currently occupying space in any way he understood, only the awful sensation of falling through decades the way a stone falls through water, decelerating, and decelerating, and decelerating, until finally, with a jolt that felt like slamming into the ground from a height of 1 inch and also from a height of 1 mile at the same time, he stopped. He was lying on cold pavement. It was daylight. It was not raining. And when he opened his eyes and looked up at a skyline he did not recognize, crowded with older buildings, fewer cameras, no visible hero agency logos anywhere at all, the first coherent thought Izuku Midoriya managed to produce was a small, disbelieving, entirely useless observation. There are no billboards. It took him several minutes of lying very still on the pavement, breathing hard, running mental diagnostics the way his mother used to make him do after nightmares. Name 5 things you can see, 5 things you can hear, before he accepted that this was not a dream, not a quirk-induced hallucination, and not, as far as he could tell, a trick. He was still wearing his ruined costume. His notebook was still in his jacket, soaked through, the pages stuck together. His phone had no signal, not even the little icon indicating a dead network, just a blank screen that suggested the entire concept of cellular service had not been invented yet in whatever year he had landed in. He sat up slowly in an alley behind what looked like a laundromat, and a newspaper skittered past his foot in the wind. He caught it before it could blow away and smoothed it flat against his knee, and the date printed at the top of the page took the last of the breath out of him more completely than the fall through time had. It was decades before he was born. A world undone. The date on the newspaper placed him more than 40 years before his own birth, in an era the history books at UA only covered in a single dense chapter titled The Dawn of Quirks and the chaos that followed. This was the world before hero licensing existed in any organized form, before the concept of a symbol of peace had crystallized into the institution Izuku had grown up admiring. Quirks were still treated as closer to a natural disaster than a career path. Vigilantes operated openly because there was no meaningful law against it yet. And somewhere in this city, according to every account Izuku had ever read, a monster who would eventually call himself All for One was already assembling the machinery of his future empire, quietly, patiently, decades before anyone had a name for him. Izuku spent his first 2 days doing the only thing that made sense to a boy who had built his entire life around preparation. He observed. He wrote in his ruined notebook, drying pages under a low fire he built behind a condemned building, filling them with cramped handwriting about street layouts, about the price of food, about the way people flinched from visible quirk use in public because there was no framework yet that told them it might be safe. He slept in doorways and ate what he could buy with the small amount of cash in his wallet, which turned out to be worthless here, forcing him toward more desperate measures involving discarded produce behind a market and an uncomfortable amount of begging. He told himself, over and over, in the voice he used to talk himself through panic attacks before big exams, that a hero's job was to help whoever was in front of them regardless of circumstances, and that the circumstances had simply become extremely strange. He was not equipped for infiltration. He was not equipped for building a life from nothing in an era with no support agencies, no found family waiting for him, no all-might poster on his wall to remind him why any of this mattered. But he had his quirk, weakened and unpredictable as it now felt, and he had 2 years of hero training, and he decided on the second night, staring up at unfamiliar stars, that if he was going to be stranded in the wreckage of history, he would at least try to leave it in better shape than he found it. The trouble was that he had no idea where to start, until the third night, when he heard the screaming. The girl who stole fire. The screaming came from a narrow lane between 2 shuttered shops, and Izuku was moving before he had finished deciding to move, old training taking over where thought lagged behind. He rounded the corner and found a girl, no older than 9 or 10, pressed into a doorway with her arms thrown up in front of her face. Standing over her was a man in a long coat who had one gloved hand extended toward her, palm open, in the particular unhurried posture of someone who believed he already owned whatever he was reaching for. Izuku knew that posture. He had studied it in security footage stills 100 years from now, in a classroom with his classmates, in a unit on historical villains that all of them had found more unsettling than any current threat. He knew the coat, the calm, the terrible patience. He was looking, he realized with a lurch of pure dread, at a version of All for One so young that the name did not yet fit him the way it eventually would, and the girl cornered in that doorway, small and shaking and radiating a crackling static charge that scorched the brick around her without her control, was a child version of a woman Izuku had grown up idolizing from old photographs and second-hand stories. Nana Shimura. The first user of One for All. The woman who would raise Toshinori Yagi and, indirectly, hand the world its symbol of peace. Right now she was simply a terrified girl who did not know that the man in front of her intended to add her quirk to his collection the way he had already, quietly, begun collecting others. Hey! Izuku shouted, because he had no plan beyond making noise and buying time, the same instinct that had gotten him through his first year at UA more often than any strategy had. Leave her alone. The young All for One turned his head with unhurried curiosity, the way a man might turn to look at a bird that had made an unexpected sound, and Izuku understood in that moment exactly how outmatched he was. This was not the aged, grievously wounded villain he might eventually have to face someday, if history proceeded as it should. This was a man near the height of his early power, decades of theft still ahead of him, and Izuku had nothing but a soaked hero costume from a country that would not exist as he knew it for 2 more generations and a quirk that pulled time like taffy in ways he barely controlled even on a good day. You're not from around here, the man said, and it was not a question. His eyes swept over Izuku's costume, the strange cut of it, the logo he did not recognize, and something behind his gaze sharpened with interest rather than alarm. Interesting. Another day, perhaps, I would ask where you came from. Today I am occupied. He turned back toward Nana, hand still extended, and Izuku ran the numbers the way he always did in the half-second before deciding whether to throw himself at something too big for him. He could not outfight this man. He could not outstrategize him with 2 days of local knowledge against decades of criminal infrastructure. But he had reached backward through impossible odds once already, catastrophically, and if his quirk had any mercy left in it, he might be able to do something smaller and more precise. He did not attack the villain. He grabbed Nana's wrist instead, planted his other hand against the brick wall behind her, and reached backward with everything he had, not through years this time, only through the last 3 seconds, winding the moment tight the instant before the villain's hand closed around empty doorway, and hurled both of them sideways through the resulting gap in causality the way a swimmer kicks off a wall. The two of them fell through the world for the second time in 2 days, this time only for the length of a single alley, appearing 20 feet down the lane in a stumbling heap while the villain's absorbing hand closed on nothing at all. The first rescue. They landed hard, Nana skidding across the cobblestones with a cry, Izuku catching most of his own weight on one forearm in a way that would leave a bruise for a week. He was on his feet again before the villain's confusion resolved into pursuit, hauling Nana up by the arm and running, not toward safety exactly, since he had no idea where safety was in this city, but toward noise, toward crowds, toward anything that might slow a man who preferred to work quietly. They burst out of the lane onto a market street thick with vendors and shoppers, and Izuku did not stop running until they had put 3 turns and a crowded fish market between themselves and the alley. Only then did he drag Nana into the recessed doorway of a shuttered tailor's shop and crouch down to her eye level, hands raised, doing his best to look like exactly what he was, which was a stranger who had just interrupted the worst day of her life and desperately needed her to trust him for the next several minutes. I know that was terrifying, he said, keeping his voice low and even, the same register he had practiced for years on frightened civilians during rescue training. I know I'm a stranger, and I know none of this makes sense. But that man wanted to take something from you, and I couldn't let him do that. My name is Izuku. What's yours? The girl was shaking so hard her teeth clicked, sparks of pale static still jumping unbidden from her fingertips and scorching small black marks into the stone at her feet. She stared at him with the particular wariness of a child who has already learned, far too young, that adults who say they only want to help are not always telling the truth. Nana, she finally said, barely audible. My name is Nana. Something in Izuku's chest cracked wide open at the sound of that name spoken by its actual owner instead of by history books and old photographs. He had grown up with this woman's legacy hanging over an entire hero society she never lived to see fully realized. He had heard Toshinori speak of her, in the handful of stories that had survived long enough to reach a boy 2 generations removed, with a reverence usually reserved for gods. And here she was, 9 years old and terrified and completely, achingly ordinary, a child who had done nothing to deserve a monster deciding her body was worth harvesting. Nana, Izuku repeated, and made himself smile even though his hands were still shaking with adrenaline. That's a good name. I'm going to help you get somewhere safe, okay? I don't know this city very well yet, I'm actually kind of new here, but I'm not going to leave you alone with that man anywhere near you. That's a promise, and I don't break those. She studied him for a long moment, the particular searching look of a child trying to decide whether an adult's promises are the kind that hold weight, and something in Izuku's open, exhausted, entirely sincere face must have tipped the scale, because she nodded once, small and tight, and let him take her hand. They spent the rest of the day moving, doubling back through streets Izuku was still learning, putting distance and confusion between themselves and anyone who might be looking. Nana knew a little more about the city than he did, which shops had kind owners, which alleys dead-ended, and between her local knowledge and his rescue instincts they managed to stay ahead of pursuit that, as far as Izuku could tell, never quite materialized. Perhaps the villain had decided one uncooperative child, in a city full of easier targets, was not worth an extended hunt. Perhaps something about Izuku's strange sudden appearance had given him pause. Izuku did not know, and for the moment he was too grateful to interrogate it. By nightfall they had found their way to the same condemned building where Izuku had been sleeping, and he built a small fire in its gutted hearth while Nana sat wrapped in his spare shirt, watching him with the wary curiosity of someone recalculating her entire understanding of the world. "You're not from here," she said eventually. "Not just this city. Somewhere else." "Someone else." Izuku blinked at her, startled by how close to the truth a 9-year-old had cut with a single sentence. "That's a strange thing to guess. You talk about heroes like they're a real job," Nana said. "Like there's schools for it, and offices, and it's normal." "Nobody talks like that." "Not yet." She hugged her knees to her chest. "I want that to be real someday. A world where people like me don't have to run." Izuku looked at this small, fierce, frightened girl who would grow up to become one of the most consequential heroes in the history he came from, who would raise a boy that would carry the world's hope on his shoulders for decades, and he made a decision that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the plain unbearable fact of her sitting in front of him, alive, asking for a future that he happened to already know was possible. "It is real," he told her. "I've seen it. I promise you, Nana, it's real, and it's coming, and I am going to do everything in my power to make sure you get to see it too." Seeds of a sanctuary. Over the following weeks, a strange and improvised household began to take shape inside the condemned building, patched together with scavenged tarps, stolen tools, and the sheer stubborn will of two people who had both, in their own ways, run out of other options. Izuku taught Nana what little he dared about the world she was destined to help build, careful never to hand her a script instead of a childhood, and Nana taught Izuku the practical business of surviving in an era with no support agencies to catch anyone who fell. She showed him which merchants would trade labor for food, how to read the mood of a street before deciding whether it was safe, and, slowly, haltingly, she showed him the outline of her own developing quirk, a raw, undisciplined stockpiling power that she did not yet have any name for and that made her spectacularly dangerous to the sort of man who collected abilities like coins. It was Nana, 3 weeks in, who first said the word sanctuary, though she did not know that was what she was proposing. "There should be a place," she said one evening, poking at the fire with a stick while Izuku mended a tear in his jacket with thread borrowed from a sympathetic seamstress. "Somewhere people like me could go. Not just from him. From anyone who wants to use us instead of just letting us be people." Izuku set down his sewing and looked at her for a long moment, turning something over in his mind that had been forming ever since the alley, ever since he first understood exactly where and when his shattered quirk had thrown him. He had spent his whole life in a world built by other people's sacrifices, inheriting a peace he had never had to fight for from its foundation. He had never imagined he might be given the chance to lay some of that foundation himself. "I've been thinking about exactly that," he admitted. "Not just for you. There are other people in this era who are in danger the same way you were, people history barely remembers because nobody was there to help them when it mattered. I think I might be able to change that. I think that might actually be the reason I'm here at all." He thought, as he said it, of 2 other names sitting heavy in the back of his mind, names he had carried in his notebook since before the fall through time, half-formed knowledge from history lessons and old family stories that suddenly felt less like trivia and more like a map. A woman named Ray, somewhere in this same decade, who according to fragments of history he barely remembered would eventually be traded into a marriage that broke her slowly over the following years. A girl named Mitsuki, younger still, whose fire would one day burn bright enough to raise a hero of her own, if someone made certain she survived long enough to get the chance. He did not know exactly where to find either of them yet. He did not know if his fractured quirk could take him there even if he did. But he knew, sitting across a small fire from a girl who was supposed to be a legend and was instead simply a frightened child asking for a safer world, that he was not going to waste this strange, terrible, impossible gift of borrowed time on anything smaller than trying. "A sanctuary," Nana said again, testing the word, and for the first time since Izuku had met her, something like hope crept into her voice instead of fear. "Do you really think we could build one?" "I think," Izuku said, "that we're already starting to." Outside, the city carried on in ignorance of the quiet, world-altering promise being made inside a condemned building by a stranded hero and a 9-year-old girl who would, if he had anything at all to say about it, never again have to run alone through a dark alley from a man who saw her only as something to take. The shape of a plan. Building a life for two people out of scavenged tarps and borrowed thread was one thing. Building a sanctuary capable of sheltering the women history had failed was another matter entirely, and Izuku spent the better part of the following month learning exactly how much he did not know about the era he had landed in. He had grown up surrounded by institutions that simply existed, hero agencies with public ledgers, a hero commission that regulated licensing, a support course that manufactured gear on demand. None of that existed yet. There was no framework to build inside, which meant that whatever he built would have to be built from raw stone, with no one to answer to and no one to ask for help. Nana proved unexpectedly useful here in ways that had nothing to do with her quirk. She had grown up on these streets in the years since her own family scattered, and she understood, with the plain unsentimental clarity of a child who had survived on her wits, exactly which parts of the city offered cover and which parts were watched. Together they mapped out the districts where a man like the young all-for-one kept the loosest attention: old industrial lots on the city's northern edge, half abandoned since a factory fire 2 winters before Izuku arrived, structurally sound enough to shelter people and remote enough that nobody with resources to spare had bothered reclaiming them yet. "If we're going to protect anyone else," Nana said, tracing a rough map into the dirt floor with a stick one evening, "we need somewhere bigger than this. Somewhere that could hold more than just us, if it had to." Izuku knelt beside her and studied the crude map, feeling the particular vertigo of watching a plan take shape that history had never recorded, because history, as far as he knew, did not remember any sanctuary standing in this city during this decade. Whatever they built here would be entirely new, a thread woven into the past that had never existed in the version of events he grew up learning. It should have frightened him more than it did. Instead it settled something in his chest that had been unsettled since the moment he understood he was stranded. He was not simply surviving inside someone else's history anymore. He was beginning, in some small and uncertain way, to write his own. "There are 2 more people I think we need to find," he told her, and he explained, as carefully and honestly as he could manage without revealing more of the future than a 9-year-old should carry, that he believed there were others out there in danger of being ground down by circumstances the same way Nana had nearly been ground down by a man with a collector's hunger. A woman, likely a little older than either of them currently understood, who he believed would eventually be forced into a marriage that would hurt her for years unless someone intervened before the arrangement ever solidified. And somewhere further off, a younger girl whose fierce temper history remembered fondly, who deserved the chance to grow up without the same losses that had shaped her the first time around. "You talk like you already know exactly how their futures happen," Nana said, watching him with the same searching look she had given him in the alley on the day they met. "Is that part of where you're from too?" Izuku hesitated, weighing honesty against the careful diplomacy he had been trying to maintain, and decided, in the end, that a girl who had already trusted him with her life deserved more truth than caution. "Yes," he admitted. "I know things about how this era is supposed to go. Not everything. Not even most things. But enough to know some people get hurt who don't have to, if somebody gets to them in time. I want to be that somebody. For you, and for them." Nana was quiet for a long moment, turning the stick over in her hands, and when she finally spoke her voice had lost none of its wariness but had gained something steadier underneath it. "Then we should go find them," she said. "Before whatever hurt them the first time gets the chance to happen again." A name on the wind. They left the city on foot 10 days later, carrying what little they could between them, Nana's static charge crackling faintly with excitement she tried and mostly failed to hide beneath a mask of practiced toughness. Izuku's notebook, dried and warped but still legible, held the closest thing he had to a map, fragments of half-remembered history about a prominent family on the western side of the country known for producing heroes with fire and ice quirks, a family that would one day be called Todoroki, though the name meant nothing yet to anyone but him. He knew, with the uneasy certainty of someone recalling a story told second-hand at a memorial years in his own future, that a woman from a modest, unremarkable family would eventually be brought into that household through an arrangement that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with breeding a stronger quirk. He knew her only by a single name, spoken once by Shoto Todoroki in a rare unguarded moment at a UA festival, a name that had stayed lodged in Izuku's memory for reasons he could not fully explain until this exact moment. Ray. He did not know her family name yet, or her age, or precisely how many years stood between now and the day the arrangement would be finalized. What he had was a general region, a general timeframe, and the stubborn conviction that if he found her early enough, before any contract had been signed and before any family had come to see her as a transaction rather than a person, there might still be room to change the shape of her future without unraveling anyone else's. What was she like? Nana asked one evening, as they made camp beside a dirt road with a small fire between them, the city several days behind. Before. In the version of things you know. Izuku considered the question carefully, aware of how little he actually knew and how much of what he did know had come filtered through a son's careful, grieving reverence rather than any direct account. Gentle, he finally said. Kind, from everything I ever heard. She loved her children more than almost anything, even when things were hardest for her. I think she deserved a life where being gentle didn't get used against her. Nana nodded slowly, watching the fire, and after a moment she said, with the particular bluntness children sometimes managed better than adults, then we make sure it doesn't. That's the whole plan, isn't it? Find the people the world was going to grind down, and get there first. That's the plan, Izuku agreed, and found himself smiling despite the exhaustion in his legs and the long road still ahead of them, because saying it out loud to someone who believed it as fiercely as he did made it feel, for the first time since he had fallen through the sky above a burning pier, less like an impossible burden and more like something they might actually manage to build together. They walked for 6 more days before the terrain began to change, the flat industrial sprawl giving way to smaller towns with cleaner air, closer to the coast, closer, Izuku hoped, to wherever the woman who would become Rei Todoroki was currently living out a childhood no one had yet decided to sell. The sanctuary's first stone. They found the old industrial lot on the northern edge of the city again on their way back through. 3 weeks later, having spent their coastal search gathering only fragments, a family name overheard in a market, a school registry glimpsed through a fogged window, nothing solid enough yet to act on but enough to know they were closer than they had been. Izuku had decided, in the end, that chasing Rei's exact location without a stronger lead risked wasting time he could spend laying groundwork closer to home, and Nana had agreed, practical as always, that a sanctuary half-built was still more useful than a rescue attempt aimed at the wrong town. The factory had been gutted by fire 2 winters prior, its roof collapsed in 2 places, but the outer walls stood sound, thick brick built to hold heavy machinery, and the lot around it was large enough to eventually shelter more than a handful of people if they were careful about how they used the space. Izuku spent the better part of a week clearing debris with his bare hands, blistering them raw, while Nana bartered with a sympathetic lumber merchant 2 streets over for scrap wood in exchange for odd jobs neither of them entirely enjoyed. It was slow, grinding, unglamorous work, nothing like the dramatic rescues Izuku had trained for at UA, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not mind it in the least. Every board they nailed into place felt like a small rebellion against the version of history that had never given Nana Shimura a place like this to come home to. It needs a name, Nana said one afternoon, standing in the cleared central room with her hands on her hips, surveying the reinforced walls and swept floor with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had earned every splinter in her palms. A sanctuary should have a name. Otherwise it's just a building. Izuku considered this, setting down the hammer he had been using to secure a loose beam, and thought of every version of the future he had ever studied, every Hero Academy motto, every founding document from an institution he had grown up trusting without ever wondering who first decided its values. He thought, too, of the 2 women still out there somewhere in this decade, unaware that a stranger from a future they would help create was already trying to build them a door out of the paths history had set for them. What about Haven, he offered. Simple. Honest about what it's for. Nana turned the word over, testing its weight the way she tested everything, and after a moment a small, genuine smile broke across her face, the first one Izuku had seen from her that carried no wariness underneath it at all. Haven, she repeated. I like that. It sounds like somewhere that keeps its promises. It will, Izuku said, and meant it with every fractured, borrowed, impossible year still left in whatever strange future he now had a hand in shaping. I'm going to make sure of that, 1 person at a time, starting with you, and not stopping until every name on that list of mine has somewhere safe to stand. Outside, the light was fading toward evening, gilding the battered brick walls of what would, in time, become the first stone of something far larger than either of them yet understood, a sanctuary built not by history's plan but by one stubborn boy's refusal to let it repeat its oldest mistakes, and by the girl standing beside him who had decided, against every reasonable expectation of a childhood spent running, that she was finally ready to stop. The long road west. Haven's walls held through the first hard rain of the season, and that alone told Izuku something he had not quite let himself believe until he watched water sheet off the patched roof instead of pooling on the factory floor. He and Nana had spent almost 2 months turning a burned-out shell into something that could actually shelter people, and now, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and rain drumming overhead, he allowed himself exactly 1 full minute of quiet satisfaction before turning his mind back to the 2 names still weighing on him. Ray. Mitsuki. Neither of them safe yet. Neither of them even aware that anything was coming for them, one way or the other. "You've got that face again," Nana said, appearing at his elbow with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, static crackling faintly at her fingertips the way it did when she was thinking hard about something. She had grown steadier over the weeks, less like a girl flinching from every shadow and more like someone who had decided, deliberately, that flinching cost too much. "The one where you're already 3 towns over in your head. I keep thinking about the timeline," Izuku admitted. "I don't know exactly how old Ray is right now, or how many years we have before the Todoroki family finalizes whatever arrangement eventually takes her in. If we go too early, we might not even recognize her. If we go too late..." He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Nana had heard enough of his half-formed worries over the past weeks to fill in the rest herself. "Then we go now, and we adjust once we're there," she said, with the particular bluntness that had become one of Izuku's favorite things about her. "Standing here worrying about being wrong isn't the same as being right. Haven will still be here when we get back. I made sure of it." She had, in fact, spent the last several days quietly arranging for a family of dock workers displaced by the same fire that had gutted the factory to keep an eye on the building while they traveled, trading a portion of Haven's cleared space for their vigilance, a small, practical alliance that Izuku had not even thought to suggest and that filled him with a fierce, complicated pride every time he considered how far Nana had come from the terrified child in the alley. They set out again 3 days later, following the same western road that had led them toward the coast the first time, only now with a clearer sense of the region Izuku half remembered from Shoto's old, guarded stories. He knew the Todoroki family held significant standing somewhere along this coastline, a household built around inherited quirks and inherited expectations in equal measure, and he knew, with the sick certainty of someone who had heard the aftermath but never the beginning, that somewhere out there a girl who did not yet know her own name would soon carry, was living whatever ordinary childhood she had left before that name was handed to her like a verdict. The family on the cliff. It took 11 days of careful, roundabout inquiry before Izuku found anything solid, and even then it came from an unlikely source, an old innkeeper near the coastal town of Sakido who liked to talk about the fine families of the region the way some people liked to talk about weather, endlessly and without much prompting. She mentioned, between complaints about the price of rice, a household on the cliffs above the harbor known locally for producing heroes with a rare dual quirk, ice and fire both, a bloodline the innkeeper spoke of with the particular mix of awe and resentment reserved for families who had turned a quirk into a dynasty. "They've been looking for a bride for the young master for years now," the innkeeper said, wiping down her counter without looking up, entirely unaware of the way Izuku's spine had gone rigid at the words. Something about wanting to breed a stronger version of his own quirk. "Ugly business, if you ask me, treating marriage like husbandry, but nobody around here has the nerve to say so where the family might hear it." Izuku thanked her, paid for 2 bowls of rice with money Nana had earned doing odd jobs along the road, and did not speak again until they were well outside the inn, walking the coastal path with the sea wind cutting through his jacket. "That's them," he said finally. "That has to be the Todoroki family. And if they're already looking for a bride, we don't have as much time as I hoped." Nana's expression hardened into the particular focus Izuku had come to recognize whenever she decided a problem was worth all of her attention. "Then we find out where the bride they're planning to pick actually lives, and we get there before they do." It took another 4 days of quiet, patient asking, in markets and at wells and outside a small coastal schoolhouse, before Izuku pieced together enough fragments to feel confident. A modest family, respected but unremarkable, living in a fishing village 2 valleys south of the Todoroki estate, with a daughter whose quirk, according to the schoolteacher who mentioned it almost in passing, produced a controlled, gentle frost that the local children found endlessly fascinating and occasionally used to cool their drinks in summer. The teacher did not know the girl's exact age, only that she was, in her words, old enough to be noticed by people who notice such things, and something about the careful, worried way she said it told Izuku that whatever process led to Rei's eventual marriage had likely already begun. They reached the fishing village on the evening of the 15th day since leaving Haven, and Izuku stood on the low ridge above it for a long moment, looking down at the modest cluster of homes and boats and drying nets, and felt, for the first time since arriving in this era, something close to real fear, not for himself, but for how easily an entire life could be quietly rearranged by people with money and expectations, without the person at the center of it ever being asked. Rei. They found her the next morning, sitting on a low sea wall with her bare feet dangling above the tide line, carefully shaping small, delicate frost patterns across the surface of the water and watching them melt with an expression of quiet, private pleasure that had nothing performative about it at all. She looked perhaps 13, maybe 14, slight and dark-haired, dressed in a plain cotton kimono that marked her as a fisherman's daughter rather than anyone's intended bride, and Izuku found himself hesitating at the top of the path down to the beach, struck by how strange it felt to look at the calm, unremarkable mourning of a girl whose future he already knew far too much about. Nana, characteristically, did not hesitate at all. She walked straight down the path and settled onto the sea wall a respectful distance away, watching the frost patterns with open curiosity until Rei glanced over, startled but not alarmed. "That's a nice trick," Nana said. "Can you make it snow, or just frost like that?" "Just frost, so far," Rei answered, a small, surprised smile crossing her face at being spoken to so plainly. "My mother says it might grow as I get older. I don't really mind either way. I like the frost." Izuku made his way down more slowly, giving the two girls time to establish something like ease between them before he arrived, and when he finally sat down on the far side of the sea wall, Rei's gaze flicked to him with the polite, faint wariness of someone raised to be cautious of strangers, but nothing sharper than that, nothing that suggested she had yet learned to fear the particular kind of attention her quirk was about to attract. "I'm Izuku," he said. "This is Nana. We're not from around here, we've been traveling, and we happened to hear about your village from a schoolteacher a few towns over. She said good things." "Not many strangers bother stopping here," Rei said, curious rather than suspicious. "It's a small village. Nothing much happens." "Sometimes small villages are exactly where the most important things happen," Izuku said, and immediately regretted how strange that sounded out loud, though Rei only tilted her head at him with mild amusement rather than alarm. He gathered himself and pressed on, choosing his next words with the same care he had used with Nana on their first night together, honest enough to be useful, careful enough not to frighten a girl who had done nothing yet to deserve frightening. "Can I ask you something that might sound strange? Has anyone from a family called Todoroki ever come through here, or asked about you, or your quirk?" The easy warmth in Rei's expression dimmed slightly, replaced by something more guarded, and Izuku understood immediately that he had touched a nerve that already existed before he arrived. "My father mentioned that name a few months ago," she said slowly. "A man came to the village asking questions about families with ice or fire quirks. My father seemed pleased about it, for reasons I didn't entirely understand. My mother did not seem pleased at all." She studied Izuku more closely now, some of the earlier ease draining out of her posture. "Why do you ask?" Izuku exchanged a brief glance with Nana, and made the decision, the same one he had made in the alley months ago and countless times since, that the girl in front of him deserved the truth more than she deserved his comfortable silence. "Because I think that family is planning to arrange a marriage for their son," he said carefully, "and I think they're considering you as the bride, based entirely on what your quirk might combine with theirs. I don't think anyone has asked you, or plans to ask you, whether that's something you'd ever want for yourself." Rei went very still, her hands, which had been idly shaping another small frost pattern on the wet stone, going motionless entirely, and for a long moment the only sound was the tide moving in against the rocks below them. How could you possibly know that, she finally said, before my own father has said a single word to me about it. What the tide brings in. Izuku had rehearsed a version of this conversation in his head for 2 weeks of travel, and every version had felt inadequate the moment Rei's careful, frightened question hung in the air between them. He settled for the same honesty that had worked, however imperfectly, with Nana. I know things about how certain futures tend to go, he said. I can't explain exactly how, and I know that sounds impossible. But I've seen enough of what happens to people in your position, when families like the Todorokis decide a quirk is worth more than the person carrying it, to know I didn't want to wait around and see if it happened to you too before doing something about it. You're saying my father would sell me, Rei said, and her voice had gone flat and careful in the specific way of someone trying very hard not to feel the full weight of a thing yet. I'm saying he might agree to an arrangement without fully understanding what it would cost you, Izuku said gently. That's not the same as him not loving you. People can love someone and still make terrible choices for them, especially when the person offering the arrangement is wealthy and persuasive and very good at making cruelty sound like opportunity. Rei was quiet for a long time, staring out at the tide, and when she finally spoke again her voice had steadied into something harder and more decided. What do you want from me, she said, if not exactly what they want? Nothing, Izuku said immediately, and meant it with his whole chest. I'm not here to decide your life for you either, just in a different direction. I want you to have the chance to decide it yourself, away from anyone who sees your quirk as an investment. There's a place, a few weeks' travel from here, that Nana and I have been building. It's not much yet, but it's meant to be somewhere people in exactly your position can go, where nobody gets to make choices about your future except you. And if I choose to stay here, Rei said, testing him, with my family, and take my chances with whatever they eventually decide? Then that's your choice to make, Izuku said, and I'll respect it, even if it scares me on your behalf. But I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't at least make sure you knew there was another option, before anyone else decided for you that there wasn't one. Rei studied him for a long moment, the wariness in her expression slowly giving way to something more complicated, grief and relief and a kind of cautious hope all tangled together, the particular look of someone who has just been handed the first piece of real agency she has ever been offered over her own life. I need to speak with my mother, she finally said. She's the one who seemed troubled when my father first mentioned the family's interest. If anyone in my house is going to understand why I might want to leave before that interest becomes an arrangement, it will be her. That evening, in the small, weathered house at the edge of the village, Rei's mother listened to her daughter's halting, uncertain account of the conversation on the sea wall with an expression that shifted, over the course of several long minutes, from alarm to something colder and more resolved. She was a thin, tired woman with the same dark hair as her daughter, and when she finally turned to look at Izuku and Nana standing awkwardly near the doorway, her eyes carried none of the suspicion Izuku had braced for. I have heard rumors about that family for years, she said quietly. How they treat the wives they bring in. How little say those wives are given in anything that happens to them afterward. She looked back at Rei, and something in her face cracked open with a grief that suggested she had already, on some level, made peace with a future she hated and felt powerless to change. I did not know how to stop your father from being flattered by their attention. I did not know there was anywhere for you to go instead. There is now, Nana said, quiet and certain, and Izuku felt something settle firmly into place in his chest at the sound of it, the same fierce resolve he had watched grow in her since the night they first sat together beside a fire in a condemned building and decided, together, that the future did not have to repeat its oldest cruelties without a fight. A father's flattery. Rei's father did not take the news well. He was a broad, weathered fisherman named Hisashi, proud in the particular way of men who had spent their whole lives with very little and had recently been handed, for the first time, the flattering attention of someone far above his station, and when his wife told him that evening that their daughter intended to leave the village with 2 strangers rather than wait to see what the Todoroki family eventually proposed, his face went through several stages of disbelief before settling into something closer to anger. You would throw away an opportunity like this, he said, pacing the small main room of the house while Rei sat rigid on a floor cushion, based on the word of 2 children who wandered in from nowhere with no family name, no standing, nothing to recommend them at all? Do you have any idea what a connection to a house like that could mean for this family? I have some idea what it could mean for me, Rei said, and Izuku, standing near the doorway with Nana at his side, felt a fierce swell of pride at the steadiness in her voice, the same hard-won steadiness he had watched Nana find over the past months. I would be the one married into it, father. Not you. I think that ought to matter more than it seems to. It is a great honor, Hisashi said, though something in his own voice had begun to waver, as though he were arguing as much with his own doubts as with his daughter. Families like that do not simply throw such offers away lightly. Husband, Rei's mother said quietly, and the single word carried enough weight that he stopped pacing entirely. I have watched you grow more pleased with yourself every week since that man first came asking about our daughter, and I have said nothing, because I told myself it was only talk, that nothing would truly come of it. But it has come to this now, and I will not stand by and watch our daughter handed over like a prize catch because a wealthy man flattered you with attention you were not equipped to see through. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Izuku found himself holding his breath without meaning to, watching Hisashi's broad shoulders sag by degrees as the anger drained out of him, replaced by something more uncertain and, eventually, something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. I only wanted good things for her, he finally said, quieter now, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. I thought I was securing her future. Then let her secure it herself, Rei's mother said, somewhere that isn't decided in advance by men discussing her quirk over tea as though she isn't a person at all. Hisashi did not agree easily, and it took the rest of the evening, long into the night, before he finally relented, not with enthusiasm but with the exhausted, grudging acceptance of a man who had run out of arguments he actually believed in. Rei's mother, for her part, made her own decision without any visible hesitation at all, informing her husband in a tone that allowed no argument that she would be accompanying her daughter for at least the early part of the journey, to see with her own eyes that this sanctuary Izuku spoke of was everything he claimed before she would consider leaving Rei anywhere without her. Izuku had not expected that, and found, once the surprise passed, that he was deeply grateful for it. A girl leaving everything she had ever known deserved, if nothing else, to make that journey with someone who loved her standing beside her. The envoy's return. They left the village 3 days later, earlier than Izuku would have liked given how little rest any of them had gotten, but a fisherman's gossip travels fast along a coastline, and word reached them on their second night of travel that a well-dressed envoy from the Todoroki estate had arrived in the village not 12 hours after their departure, inquiring, with barely concealed impatience, after the fisherman's daughter and the arrangement he had come to formalize. They learned this from a merchant heading the opposite direction along the coast road, who mentioned it as idle traveling news, entirely unaware of how the color drained from Rei's face at the description or how quickly Izuku's hand went to the strap of his bag, an old, useless instinct from a life where danger meant reaching for gear that no longer existed in this era. He'll know I'm gone, Rei said, once the merchant had passed out of earshot. He'll know exactly why, too, if my father says anything at all about strangers arriving before we left. Your father won't say more than he has to, her mother said firmly, though the tightness around her eyes suggested she was not entirely certain of that herself. But we should assume the worst regardless. Men with that kind of money do not simply let go of something they have decided they want. Izuku spent that night awake longer than he should have, turning over strategies the way he used to turn over villain profiles back at UA, trying to calculate how much of a lead they actually had and how far a wealthy man's patience might stretch before he decided a runaway bride was worth the expense of pursuit. He did not have good answers. He had never operated in an era with no phones, no rapid transit, no way to verify a threat's location except by outrunning rumors on foot, and the uncertainty of it gnawed at him more than any single confrontation would have. The envoy caught up with them on the 5th day, not through any particular cunning, but through the simple, brutal efficiency of hired men on horseback covering ground far faster than 4 people traveling on foot. He was a narrow, precise man in fine traveling clothes, flanked by 2 others who carried themselves with the coiled readiness of hired muscle rather than servants, and when he reined in his horse on the road ahead of them, blocking their path with the casual confidence of someone who had never once in his life been told no and made it stick, Izuku felt the old, familiar readiness of hero training settle over him like a second skin. You have something that belongs to my employer's household, the envoy said, addressing Rei directly, as though her mother and Izuku and Nana were simply obstacles rather than people. An arrangement was made in good faith. I would strongly advise you reconsider whatever foolishness has led you this far from home. No arrangement was made with me, Ray said, and though her voice shook slightly, she did not look away from him. Only with my father, and only because he was flattered into it before anyone thought to ask whether I wanted it at all. Sentiment is a luxury, the envoy said, dismissive, already gesturing for the men flanking him to move closer, that families of your standing rarely get to indulge. I am authorized to escort you back regardless of your current feelings on the matter. This need not become unpleasant. It already is unpleasant, Nana said, stepping forward with her chin raised and static crackling faintly at her fingertips, 9 years old going on something far older and fiercer, and Izuku, watching her plant herself between Ray and the approaching men without a flicker of hesitation, felt his own resolve harden into something immovable. She's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to go, Izuku said, moving to stand beside Nana, and neither is anyone else on this road. I'd suggest you turn around and tell your employer that this particular arrangement is over, before this becomes a great deal more unpleasant than you're currently prepared for. What Static and Frost can do. The envoy laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and gestured his men forward with the easy confidence of someone who had never once had to reconsider his own strength, and Izuku understood, with the particular clarity that came before every fight he had ever trained for, that reasoning was finished and the only language left was one his body already knew. He moved first, closing the distance before either hired man had fully dismounted, driving his shoulder into the nearest one's chest with enough force to knock him sideways off balance, years of hero training translating instinctively into the kind of controlled, restraining grapple meant to incapacitate without doing lasting harm. The second man came at him with a short club, and Izuku ducked under the swing, caught the man's wrist, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling into the dirt beside the road. Beside him, Nana had not moved from where she stood, but the air around her had begun to hum, static gathering visibly along her arms in pale, crackling arcs, untrained and raw but unmistakably dangerous, and when the envoy himself finally swung down from his horse with the irritated impatience of a man who had expected this to be over already, she raised both hands and released a controlled burst of static electricity that scorched a warning line into the dirt directly in front of his boots. Close enough to make him flinch back with a startled curse. That was a warning, Nana said, her voice steadier than her 9 years had any right to sound. The next one won't miss on purpose. Ray's mother, for her part, had positioned herself protectively in front of her daughter, and Ray herself, trembling but resolute, had begun to draw a thin sheet of frost across the ground around her own feet, an instinctive defensive reflex that neither training nor confidence had put there, only the plain desperate will not to be taken. The envoy stared at the 2 children in front of him, one crackling with barely restrained static and the other freezing the ground beneath her own feet, and something in his carefully composed confidence finally cracked. He was not a fighter himself, Izuku realized, only a man accustomed to having enough hired muscle around him that he never needed to be one, and with both of his men currently sprawled in the dirt and 2 dangerous, furious young Quirk users in front of him, the calculation in his eyes shifted rapidly towards self-preservation. This is not finished, he said, retreating toward his horse with considerably less composure than he had arrived with. My employer will not simply let this go. Tell your employer, Izuku said, standing his ground, breathing hard but entirely unmoved, that if he sends anyone else after this family, he will find that the cost of pursuing them keeps getting steeper every single time. Tell him the girl he wanted made her own choice, and he is going to have to live with not getting his way for once. The envoy did not answer, only gathered his stunned men with visible effort and rode off back the way they had come, and the 4 of them stood on the empty road for a long moment afterward, breathing hard, adrenaline still crackling through the air almost as visibly as Nana's static had. He's right that it might not be finished, Ray's mother said quietly, once the sound of hoofs had faded. Men like that rarely accept losing gracefully. Then we make sure wherever we're taking you is somewhere he can't easily reach, Izuku said, and found, beneath the exhaustion and the adrenaline, a fierce and steady certainty that had not existed in him back on that burning pier months and lifetimes ago. He was not simply reacting to danger anymore. He was building something strong enough to stand against it. The second stone. The journey back to Haven took 11 days, longer than the trip out had taken, slowed by the need for caution and by Ray's mother's understandable insistence on rest stops that did not exhaust her daughter past the point of good sense. They arrived on a gray, overcast afternoon, and Izuku watched Rei's face as she took in the reinforced brick walls, the patched roof, the modest but sturdy shape of what he and Nana had built from nothing over the preceding months, and something in her expression, tired and travel-worn as she was, settled into quiet, genuine wonder. "You built this," Rei said. "The two of you, alone?" "With help from people we traded favors with," Nana said, though the pride in her voice was unmistakable. "It's not finished. It's barely started, really. But it's ours, and nobody gets to decide what happens inside these walls except the people who live here." The dockworkers' family Nana had arranged to watch the building had kept their word, and Haven had not only survived their absence but grown slightly in it, another small room framed out, a section of roof reinforced against the coming winter. Izuku found himself absurdly moved by the sight of it, proof that what they were building did not depend entirely on his own presence to keep growing, that it had already begun to take on a life and momentum of its own. Rei's mother spent 3 days at Haven before finally, tearfully, preparing to return to the fishing village, satisfied that her daughter had found somewhere genuinely safe rather than simply trading one uncertain situation for another. Her parting words to Izuku, delivered quietly while Rei said her own goodbyes to Nana nearby, stayed with him for a long time afterward. "I do not know what you are, or where you truly came from," she said, "and I have decided I do not need to know, as long as what you are building keeps girls like my daughter safe. But I will tell you this. Word travels along the coast faster than you might think. If you intend to keep doing what you did on that road, keep pulling people out of futures that were never fair to them in the first place, you should prepare for the possibility that more than one wealthy family is going to come looking for answers eventually." Izuku thought of the man in the alley who was not yet called all for one, of the envoy retreating on his horse with a threat only half swallowed, and nodded slowly, feeling the weight of a promise expanding to match the scale of what he was actually trying to build. "I know," he said. "I'm trying to be ready for that. I don't think I can protect everyone who needs it working only in secret forever. Eventually this has to become something bigger than two people patching a building together in the dark." "Then I hope you build it well," Rei's mother said, and embraced her daughter one final time before setting off alone down the coast road, leaving behind a girl who, for the first time in longer than she could remember, got to decide entirely for herself what her own future would look like. That night, with Rei settled into a small room of her own within Haven's growing walls and Nana asleep beside the low fire, Izuku sat alone at the building's entrance and looked out at the dark, unfamiliar sky, thinking of the third name still waiting somewhere out there in this vast, half-written decade. Mitsuki. A fierce, fire-tempered girl whose story he barely remembered in outline, whose danger he could not yet name with any precision, only feel, the same instinctive certainty that had pulled him into an alley to save Nana and onto a coast road to protect Rei. 2 stones laid. A third name waiting. And somewhere out there, still patient, still gathering power decade by decade, a man who had already noticed a stranger interfering with his plans once, and who would not, Izuku suspected, forget it quite so easily a second time. Growing pains. Winter settled over Haven more gently than Izuku had feared, though it brought its own particular difficulties: a leaking section of roof that took 3 cold, miserable days to properly patch, a shortage of firewood that sent Izuku and Rei out foraging together more often than either of them found comfortable given how little either of them knew about surviving a rural winter, and the slow, inevitable friction of 3 very different people learning to share a single small space without the benefit of long familiarity to smooth the rough edges. Rei, it turned out, kept house with a quiet, meticulous discipline that put both Izuku and Nana's improvised habits to shame, and within 2 weeks of her arrival Haven had acquired something it had never had before: a functioning kitchen corner, mended blankets, a system for rationing their limited food that stretched further than Izuku would have believed possible. She did not speak often about the life she had left behind, but Izuku noticed the careful, deliberate way she threw herself into the practical work of building a home, as though proving to herself, one swept floor and one mended blanket at a time, that this new life was solid enough to bear her full weight. Nana, for her part, had appointed herself Haven's unofficial scout and negotiator, venturing into the nearest town every few days to trade small services for supplies, building a slow, careful network of sympathetic merchants and dock workers who asked few questions and offered what quiet help they could. It was Nana who first suggested, one cold evening while mending a torn sleeve by firelight, that Haven would eventually need more than the three of them if it was going to become anything like the sanctuary she had first imagined back in that condemned building in the city. "We can't be the only ones who ever get pulled out of something terrible," she said. "Once people hear there's somewhere safe, more of them are going to come looking, whether we go find them or not. We should be ready for that." "I've been thinking the same thing," Izuku admitted. "I don't know exactly how big this needs to become, or how fast. But I know we can't keep it small and secret forever if we actually want it to matter to more than the three of us." Ray, listening quietly from where she knelt folding blankets near the fire, spoke up with the same careful precision she brought to everything. "Then we should decide now what kind of place we want this to be, before more people arrive and we're deciding it by accident instead of on purpose." "Rules?" "Not many, but enough that everyone who comes here knows what to expect." It was Ray, in the end, who drafted the first simple, handwritten set of principles that would eventually hang, framed, near Haven's main entrance for decades to come, though none of the three of them sitting around that fire could have known it yet. No one is property here. No one's quirk belongs to anyone but themselves. Everyone who stays contributes what they can, and takes only what they need. Anyone may leave whenever they choose, and anyone who leaves may always come back. Izuku read the short list twice, feeling something settle firmly into place in his chest, the particular satisfaction of watching an idea he had carried alone for months finally take a shape solid enough for other people to help carry it too. "It's a good start," he said. "It's more than a start. It's exactly what this place should be. What the fire remembers." The first real snow of the season fell on a night Izuku would remember for a long time afterward, not because of the weather itself, but because of the conversation it prompted, huddled close around Haven's hearth with the wind finding every gap in the walls they had not yet finished sealing. Ray had taken to asking Izuku careful, measured questions about the future he came from, never pressing further than he seemed willing to go, and that night, watching the snow gather in drifts against the single small window, she asked him something that caught him off guard. "You've told us both, in your own way, that you already know pieces of what happens to us," she said. "Not everything. But pieces. Is there anyone else out there like us, waiting for you to reach them before something happens that can't be undone?" Izuku set down the length of rope he had been coiling and considered the question with the same weight he gave every decision about how much of the future to share. He thought of a girl with a temper like a struck match and a heart, according to every fragment of story he had ever heard about her, considerably softer than she ever let anyone see. He thought of a boy she would one day marry, a boy who did not exist yet in this decade at all, and the son the two of them would eventually raise together, a boy who would grow up to inherit a burden Izuku understood better than almost anyone alive. "There's one more name," he admitted. "A girl, younger than either of you right now, with a temper that history remembers fondly, and a strength that I think the people around her are going to need long before they realize it. I don't know exactly where she is yet, or what danger might already be circling her. I only know her name, and that I think we need to find her before whatever the future originally had planned for her gets the chance to happen again." "What's her name?" Nana asked, leaning forward with the same fierce, protective focus she had shown from the very first night Izuku met her. "Mitsuki," Izuku said, and saying the name out loud, in this room, surrounded by two girls he had already pulled free of futures that might have broken them, felt like planting a flag in ground he had not yet reached. Ray was quiet for a moment, turning the name over. "You keep talking about the people you're trying to save," she finally said, "but you never talk about who saves you, in whatever future you came from. Was there no one, before all this, looking out for you the way you're looking out for us?" The question landed somewhere Izuku had not expected, and he found himself smiling, small and a little tired, thinking of his mother's endless patience, of Toshinori's hard-won faith in him, of an entire generation of teachers and classmates who had shaped him long before he ever fell backward through time to shape anyone else. "There was," he said. "A lot of people, actually. I had a mother who never once stopped believing in me even when I gave her every reason to worry. I had a mentor who saw something worth building in me before I saw it in myself. I had friends who would have walked through fire for me, the same way I'm trying to walk through it for the two of you now." He looked at Nana, then at Ray, feeling the strange, humbling weight of the thought settling over him fully for the first time. I think that's part of why I couldn't just let either of you fall through the cracks the way history said you would. I know exactly how much difference it makes, having someone refuse to let you fall. I wanted to be that for someone else, if I ever got the chance. Nana, who rarely allowed herself open displays of sentiment, leaned quietly against his shoulder without a word, and Ray, across the fire, offered him a small, steady smile that carried more warmth in it than anything she had said aloud since her arrival. Then we'll help you find her, Ray said. Whoever this Mitsuki is. She won't fall through any cracks either. Not with the three of us looking for her. A shadow takes notice. Far from Haven, in a city Izuku had left behind months earlier, a man who had not yet earned the name history would eventually give him sat alone in a quiet, well-appointed room, turning a small, curious problem over in his mind with the patient, methodical attention he brought to everything that threatened, even slightly, the empire he was still decades away from fully building. He remembered the boy from the alley clearly, the strange costume, the stranger Quirk that had folded space and time together long enough to steal a promising acquisition directly out of his open hand. He remembered, too, the reports that had reached him in the following weeks, fragmentary and second-hand, of a girl matching that same alley's description turning up alongside a boy of similar description far to the west, in the vicinity of a prominent, well-connected family currently arranging a marriage for their son. He did not yet know the boy's name. He did not yet know precisely what the boy's quirk was capable of, beyond the single unsettling display he had witnessed firsthand. But he understood patterns, understood them better than almost anyone alive in this era, and the pattern emerging here was difficult to ignore. Someone was moving through this decade with knowledge he should not possess, intervening in futures that should have belonged, by every reasonable expectation, entirely to chance. It did not alarm him. Very little did, at this stage of his long, patient life. But it interested him, in the particular, dangerous way that puzzles interested men who had never in their lives encountered one they could not eventually solve, and he found himself, for the first time in a great many years, genuinely curious to meet this strange boy again, under circumstances that would allow him more time than a single startled minute in an alley to understand exactly what he was dealing with. He made a note, in the careful, precise hand he used for matters he considered worth remembering, and set it aside among the other threads he was patiently gathering toward whatever vast, waiting design he had already begun assembling in his mind. There was no need to hurry. He had, as far as he understood the world, all the time that mattered. And a boy who could apparently borrow time itself was, if nothing else, a resource worth understanding fully before deciding whether he was worth acquiring, or simply worth removing from the board entirely. Somewhere far to the north, unaware of the quiet, patient attention that had just turned toward him, Izuku Midoriya slept soundly beside a low fire in a building he had built with his own blistered hands, one girl safe beside him, another finally free of a future that would have broken her, and a third name waiting somewhere out in the dark, still unaware that anyone was coming for her at all. Spring and its debts. Winter loosened its grip on Haven slowly, in the grudging, uneven way of a season that did not want to admit defeat, and by the time the first green shoots pushed up through the thawing ground around the factory's walls, Izuku had grown so accustomed to the rhythm of their small, strange household that it took him a moment, most mornings, to remember how recently all of it had not existed at all. Ray had claimed the kitchen corner as fully her own, coaxing something like real meals out of their limited stores. Nana had expanded her network of contacts in town until Haven received a small, steady trickle of supplies traded for labor nobody asked too many questions about, and Izuku himself had spent the winter months doing the quieter, less dramatic work of a founder rather than a rescuer, reinforcing walls, mapping the surrounding region, and turning over, again and again, the single thin thread of information he had about the third name on his list. Mitsuki. A temper like a struck match. A heart, by every account he had ever heard secondhand, softer than she let anyone see. A woman who would one day marry a man not yet born in this decade and raise a son who would carry, at least in part, the weight of an entire hero society on his shoulders. Izuku knew almost nothing else. He did not know her family name, or her age, or which town in this vast, half-mapped country might currently hold a girl who did not yet know how much would eventually depend on her simply surviving her own childhood. We can't search randomly forever, Ray said one evening, laying out the modest supplies they had gathered for a longer expedition across the low table that had become, by unspoken agreement, the place where the three of them made decisions together. We need a better starting point than a name and a feeling. I've been thinking about that, Izuku admitted. The one thing I remember clearly is that she grows up to become close, eventually, with a family that produces heroes with explosive quirks, fire, and force together. If I'm right about the timeline, that family might already exist in some early form, even if the specific connection to Mitsuki hasn't happened yet. If we can find where a family like that is currently established, we might be closer to her than we think. Nana, who had spent the winter listening to every scrap of regional gossip that passed through Haven's growing network, sat up straighter at that. There's a merchant who comes through town twice a month, sells goods from the eastern provinces. He mentioned once, offhand, a village known for producing loud, hot-tempered people with explosive quirks, said it half as a joke, the way people talk about towns known for a particular kind of weather. I didn't think much of it until now. Izuku felt something settle into place, the particular electric certainty that came whenever a scattered handful of facts suddenly resolved into a workable plan. That could be exactly what we're looking for. If there's already a concentration of that kind of quirk in one place, that's more likely to be where the family Mitsuki eventually connects to actually lives, or at least somewhere close to it. Then that's where we go, Ray said, with the quiet, decisive certainty she had grown into over the winter months. No longer the uncertain girl on the sea wall but someone who had learned, in the short time since her own rescue, exactly how much good a person could do once they stopped waiting for permission to act. They set out 3 days later, once the roads had dried enough to travel comfortably, leaving Haven once again in the capable hands of the dockworkers' family and a small, growing circle of townsfolk who had come, over the winter, to trust the strange trio enough to look after their building without asking too many questions about where they kept disappearing to. The village of short fuses. The village, when they finally reached it after 9 days of travel, lived up to its reputation almost immediately. Izuku had barely stepped past the outer fence line before he witnessed a shouting match between two shopkeepers over the price of rope that ended not in violence but in a kind of good-natured, explosive laughter that suggested the argument itself had been half performance, a local sport rather than a genuine grievance. Small controlled bursts of heat shimmered in the air above several rooftops, evidence of quirks being idly exercised rather than restrained, and the whole place carried an energy Izuku found almost disarmingly warm after months spent in Haven's quieter, more careful atmosphere. I like it here, Nana declared, watching a group of children chase each other through the square, small sparks of orange light trailing from their palms in a game that looked equal parts dangerous and delighted. It's loud. It's loud, Izuku agreed, which might make it harder to find one specific loud person among many. We should ask carefully. We don't want it getting back to anyone that strangers are looking for a particular girl by name, not until we know more about why she might need finding at all. They spent 2 days asking careful, roundabout questions, learning the shape of the village's families the way Izuku had learned the shape of Ray's coastal town months before, and it was Ray, unexpectedly, who found the first solid thread, striking up a conversation with an elderly woman selling dried fish who spoke, with obvious fondness, about a particular household known throughout the village for its 2 spirited daughters, the younger of whom, barely more than a toddler currently, already showed signs of a temper explosive enough to match her quirk. There's an older one too, though, the fish seller added, almost as an afterthought, closer to your age, I'd guess. Fiercest girl in this whole village, and that's saying something around here. Name's Mitsuki. Everyone knows her. Half the boys are terrified of her and the other half are hopelessly in love, which tells you about all you need to know. Izuku felt his breath catch at the name spoken so casually, so entirely without the weight it carried in his own memory, and he thanked the fish seller with more warmth than the small purchase strictly warranted before pulling Ray and Nana aside once they were out of earshot. That's her, he said. That has to be her. Then why do you look worried instead of relieved? Ray asked, watching him with the same careful perceptiveness she brought to everything. We found her faster than we found me. That should be good news. Izuku hesitated, turning over the fragments of memory he actually had about Mitsuki's early life, thin and second-hand as they were, filtered through decades of family stories he had only ever heard from her son in passing. He did not know precisely what danger had originally threatened her in the history he remembered. He only knew, with an unease he could not fully explain, that something had, eventually, gone badly enough in her early life that it had shaped her into someone who kept her softer edges carefully hidden behind a wall of fire and temper for the rest of her days. I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to be protecting her from yet, he admitted. That's what worries me. With Nana, I saw the danger with my own eyes. With Rei, I at least knew the shape of the threat before we found her. Here, I only know that something in her past leaves a mark deep enough that she spends the rest of her life guarding herself against ever being that vulnerable again. I don't know what that something is. I don't know if it's already happened, or if it's still ahead of her. Then we watch, and we learn, Nana said, practical as ever, before we do anything that might make things worse by moving too fast without understanding what we're actually up against. Mitsuki. They found her the following afternoon, in the middle of what appeared to be a one-sided argument with 3 older boys near the village training yard, and Izuku's first real look at the girl who would one day raise a hero came in the form of watching her plant her feet, cross her arms, and deliver a scathing, articulate dressing down to a boy nearly twice her size who had apparently made the mistake of suggesting her quirk was too dangerous for a girl to be trusted with unsupervised. Too dangerous for me to be trusted with, Mitsuki repeated, her voice carrying easily across the yard, sharp and bright with an anger that seemed less like losing her temper and more like wielding it deliberately, a blade she had chosen to draw rather than one that had simply slipped loose. You've set your own sleeve on fire twice this month practicing the exact same technique I mastered when I was 7. Maybe worry about your own control before you start lecturing mine. The boy, red-faced, retreated with his friends amid a smattering of laughter from onlookers, and Mitsuki turned away with the satisfied, unbothered air of someone who had won an argument she considered barely worth the effort of having. She was perhaps 12, blonde, sharp-featured even at that age, with a coiled, restless energy that reminded Izuku, in an instant flash of recognition that hit harder than he expected, of a boy he had grown up idolizing. A boy who would not exist for decades yet but whose explosive temper and fierce protective streak were, Izuku realized with something between amusement and vertigo, clearly inherited from exactly the kind of woman standing in front of him now. Nana approached first, as she usually did, drawn by simple curiosity rather than any particular strategy, and struck up a conversation about the argument that had just concluded with an easy directness that Mitsuki seemed to appreciate more than she expected to. You didn't even raise your voice, Nana observed. Most people get louder when they're angry. You got sharper instead. Mitsuki studied her for a moment, something assessing and faintly approving in her expression. Yelling just tells people you've lost control. I'd rather make my point and let them realize afterward how badly they lost. Her gaze shifted to Izuku and Rei, standing a respectful distance back, and narrowed slightly with the particular wariness of someone who had learned early to notice when she was being observed. You're not from around here. I'd remember faces like yours. We're traveling, Izuku said, keeping his tone easy, unthreatening, the same register that had worked with both Nana and Rei in their own first conversations. We've been hearing about this village for a while. Sounded like an interesting place. It's loud and it's proud of being loud, Mitsuki said, with a shrug that suggested she found nothing wrong with either quality. Not much else to say about it. They talked for a while longer, easy and unremarkable on the surface, Izuku carefully steering the conversation toward Mitsuki's family, her daily life, anything that might reveal the shape of whatever danger history had once left her to face alone, and it was only near the end of their conversation, when Rei asked, gently, whether Mitsuki had always lived in the village, that something flickered across the girl's sharp, guarded expression, quick and gone almost before Izuku registered it. Not always, Mitsuki said, her voice going carefully flat in a way that reminded Izuku uncomfortably of Rei's own careful flatness the first time he had raised the subject of the Todoroki family. We moved here a few years ago. Before that we lived somewhere else. I don't really talk about before. It took another 4 days of careful, patient friendship building before Mitsuki trusted them enough to talk about before at all, and when she finally did, sitting on the low wall outside her family's modest home while her parents were away trading at a neighboring market, her voice had none of its usual sharpness, only a tired, guarded honesty that made her seem, for the first time since they had met her, exactly as young as she actually was. "We used to live in a bigger town, closer to the coast," she said, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve rather than looking at any of them directly. "My quirk came in early, and it came in strong, stronger than anyone expected for someone my age." There was a man there who noticed. He ran some kind of collection agency, said he was interested in training promising young talents, offered my parents money to let him take me somewhere he could develop my quirk properly. Her jaw tightened. "My father almost said yes. We didn't have much money, and he made it sound like an opportunity instead of what it actually was." Izuku felt something cold settle in his chest, an old, familiar dread that had first taken root in an alley months ago and never fully left him since. "What actually was it?" he asked carefully. "My mother figured it out before it went any further," Mitsuki said. She'd heard rumors, from a cousin in another town, about children who went off with men like that and were never heard from again, or came back different, broken somehow, like something had been taken out of them along with whatever they'd been promised in return. She refused. My father argued with her for weeks, but she wouldn't budge, and eventually she convinced him, and we packed up everything and moved here instead, somewhere far enough away that the man couldn't easily follow. Mitsuki's hands had curled into fists at some point during the story, though her voice stayed remarkably level. "I don't know if he's still looking. I don't know if he ever stopped. My mother still gets nervous every time a stranger asks too many questions about me, which is part of why I almost didn't talk to any of you at all." Izuku exchanged a look with Nana and Rei, both of whom wore matching expressions of grim, private recognition, and he understood, with the sick certainty of pieces falling into a pattern he had seen too many times already in this decade, exactly what kind of man Mitsuki was describing, even without a name attached to the description. Not all for one himself, likely, the timeline and the details did not quite match, but someone cut from the same cloth, another predator drawn to promising young quirks the way certain men in every era seemed drawn to power they had not earned themselves, willing to exploit desperate families to acquire it. "Your mother made the right call," Izuku said quietly. "Getting you away before it went any further. That took real courage, especially with your father arguing the other way." "I know," Mitsuki said, and for just a moment the guarded toughness cracked enough to show something raw underneath, a residual fear she clearly still carried despite the years and distance since. "I just wish I didn't still feel like I'm waiting for him to find us again someday. I hate feeling like that. It doesn't fit who I want to be." "It doesn't make you weak to still feel it," Rei said gently, with the particular authority of someone who understood exactly what it meant to carry the aftermath of an almost catastrophe long after the immediate danger had passed. "I still catch myself flinching sometimes when I see well-dressed strangers on the road, and I know exactly why, and knowing why doesn't make the flinch go away." Mitsuki studied Rei for a long moment, something shifting behind her sharp, guarded eyes, and whatever she saw there seemed to settle something in her, because when she spoke again her voice had steadied back into something closer to her usual confident edge, though gentler now, more genuinely offered rather than performed. "You've dealt with something like this too," she said. It was not quite a question. "All three of us have," Nana said. "In our own ways. That's actually part of why we came looking for you in the first place. An invitation." Izuku told her about Haven carefully, the same way he had told Rei months before, honest about what it was and equally honest about what he could not promise, and Mitsuki listened with the sharp, evaluating attention of someone who had learned young not to accept offers at face value. "So it's a place where people like us go to hide," she said, when he finished. "From men like the one who wanted to buy me." "It's a place where people like us go to be safe," Izuku corrected gently. "Hiding makes it sound like the goal is staying small and invisible forever. That's not what we're building. We wanted to grow into somewhere strong enough that eventually people like that stop being a threat at all, not because we're hidden from them, but because we're not afraid of them anymore." Mitsuki considered this for a long moment, tracing an idle pattern of small sparks along her knuckles, a habit Izuku had noticed she fell into whenever she was thinking hard about something. "And if I don't want to leave my family behind to go live in a building with 3 strangers I met 4 days ago? Then you don't have to," Izuku said simply. "This isn't an arrangement, and I'm not here to make decisions for you the way that man tried to make one for your family. I just wanted you to know the option exists, in case it's ever useful, whether that's tomorrow or years from now. Haven isn't going anywhere. Something in Mitsuki's expression eased slightly at that, the wariness of someone bracing for a hidden condition finding, instead, an offer with no strings attached at all. You're strange, she said, though not unkindly. Most people who go out of their way to find someone want something back for the trouble. We know exactly what that feels like, Ray said quietly, which is part of why none of us are interested in doing it to anyone else. Mitsuki did not agree to come with them that day, and Izuku had not expected her to. She had a family here, a life she had built in the years since her mother's brave, stubborn refusal, and uprooting it on the word of 3 strangers, however sincere, would have been its own kind of reckless. But she did agree, eventually, to keep the location of Haven in mind, carefully committed to memory rather than written down anywhere that might be found, a promise between the 4 of them that the offer would remain open regardless of how much time passed before she decided whether to use it. They stayed in the village another week, long enough to be certain no immediate danger was closing in, and it was on the final evening before their planned departure that the danger, as it so often seemed to in this decade, arrived anyway. The collector returns. The man arrived at dusk, in a fine carriage that looked entirely out of place among the village's modest homes, and Izuku knew the moment he saw the crest painted discreetly on its door, a stylized coin wrapped in chain, exactly who had finally come to collect on an old, unfinished transaction. He was younger than Izuku had expected, though something in his bearing, patient, unhurried, faintly amused by his own certainty, reminded him uncomfortably of the man in the alley who was not yet called all for one. The same collector's calm laid over an entirely different kind of appetite. I understand a family here once declined an offer of mine, the man said, addressing Mitsuki's parents on their own doorstep with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to eventually getting what he wanted, and I find myself, some years later, still curious whether that decision might be reconsidered, given how much more valuable a fully matured quirk tends to be than an untested one. Mitsuki's mother, a sharp-featured woman who Izuku could immediately see was where her daughter had inherited both her temper and her courage, stepped forward with her chin raised and her voice steady despite the visible tension in her shoulders. Our answer has not changed in the years since you last asked it. It will not change now, or ever. I would ask you to leave, and not come back. The man's expression did not shift, exactly, but something behind his eyes sharpened with the particular displeasure of someone unaccustomed to being refused twice. A pity, he said. I had hoped this could remain civil. He glanced past her, toward the doorway where Mitsuki stood rigid, fists clenched, static sparks jumping visibly along her knuckles, and something in his gaze turned assessing in a way that made Izuku's stomach twist with old, familiar anger. She's grown considerably since I last saw her. That quirk looks even more promising than I estimated. You don't get to look at her like that, Izuku said, stepping forward before he had fully decided to, placing himself deliberately in the man's line of sight. You don't get to look at any of them like that. The man's attention shifted to Izuku with mild, unhurried curiosity, taking in his unfamiliar clothing, his evident readiness for a fight he had clearly not expected to find waiting on this particular doorstep. And who exactly are you, to speak for this family's decisions? Nobody who speaks for them, Izuku said. Somebody who's going to make sure their decision gets respected regardless of what you think you're owed for the trouble of asking twice. The man studied him for a long moment, and Izuku watched him make the same rapid calculation the envoy on the coast road had made months earlier, weighing the visible readiness of the people in front of him against however much this particular acquisition was actually worth to him, and after a tense, silent moment, he stepped back toward his carriage with the same unhurried composure he had arrived with, refusing to give either satisfaction or genuine retreat. This conversation is not finished, he said, to Mitsuki's family and, Izuku suspected, to him as well. I do not abandon promising investments easily. I will simply choose a better time to revisit the matter. He climbed into his carriage without waiting for a response, and it pulled away down the darkening road, leaving behind a tense, ringing silence that took several long minutes to fully dissipate. Mitsuki's mother turned to Izuku with an expression that mixed gratitude and fresh, sharpened fear in equal measure. He'll come back, she said quietly. Men like that always do, eventually, once they've decided something belongs to them. Then it's time to decide what you want to do about that, Izuku said gently, before he chooses that better time on his own terms instead of yours. A family's choice. The decision, when it finally came, was not an easy one, and Izuku watched it unfold over the course of a long, difficult night around the family's kitchen table, Mitsuki's father arguing, with obvious pain, that uprooting their entire life a second time felt like losing to the very threat they had already run from once, and Mitsuki's mother arguing, with the hard-won clarity of someone who had already made this exact choice before and lived with the consequences, that safety mattered more than the comfort of staying somewhere familiar. We ran once already, she said, and it bought us years, good years, but it did not make the danger disappear, only delay it. I am not willing to spend the rest of our lives waiting for him to choose his moment. I would rather choose ours. Mitsuki, who had said very little throughout the long discussion, finally spoke up with a directness that silenced the room. I'm not a child anymore. I get a say in this too, and my say is that I'm done being afraid of a man who thinks my quirk is worth more than I am. If Haven is real, and if it's actually as safe as they say it is, I want to go. Not just to run from him. To actually build something, the way they've been building it, instead of just hiding from what's chasing us. Her father, worn down by exhaustion and by the plain, undeniable courage in his daughter's voice, finally relented, and by the following morning the family had made their choice, not fleeing in secret the way Mitsuki's mother had once fled toward this village, but departing openly, deliberately, toward a place built specifically to make certain no one ever had to make that choice out of fear again. The journey back to Haven took considerably longer with an entire family in tow rather than the smaller groups Izuku had traveled with before, but it passed without further incident, the collector's carriage never reappearing on the road behind them, though Izuku found himself glancing back over his shoulder more often than he would have liked to admit, unable to fully shake the unease of a threat postponed rather than resolved. They arrived at Haven on a warm, bright afternoon nearly 3 weeks after leaving the village, and Izuku watched Mitsuki's expression as she took in the reinforced walls, the small framed set of principles hanging near the entrance, the quiet, industrious activity of a household that had grown, in the year since its founding, into something considerably more solid than the burned-out shell it had once been. This is really it, Mitsuki said, something like wonder breaking through her usual sharp composure. You actually built this. From nothing. From nothing but deciding it mattered enough to try, Nana said, with the particular pride Izuku had come to recognize as uniquely hers, earned through months of blistered hands and careful negotiation and the fierce, unwavering belief that a childhood spent running did not have to be every childhood's ending. Welcome to Haven. Yours too, if you want it. 4 stones. Settling an entire family into Haven required more work than any single rescue had, and Izuku spent the following weeks in the satisfying, exhausting business of expansion, framing out 2 more rooms with Mitsuki's father, who turned out to have genuine skill with carpentry once he stopped grieving the life he had left behind and started investing himself in the one being built in its place, while Mitsuki's mother took to organizing Haven's growing store of supplies with an efficiency that even Rei, who had held that role alone until now, found herself grateful to share. Mitsuki herself adjusted more slowly, prickly and restless in the way of someone unused to feeling safe enough to stop bracing for the next blow, but Izuku watched, over the following weeks, the same slow thaw he had witnessed in Nana and in Rei begin to work on her too, watched her sharp edges soften by degrees around the people who had chosen, deliberately and without condition, to make room for her. It was Nana, unsurprisingly, who broke through first, drawn to Mitsuki's fierce, unapologetic temper the way she was drawn to anything with real backbone, and the two of them fell into an easy, sparring friendship within days that reminded Izuku, with a private ache of recognition, of dynamics he had known in another life entirely. 4 of us now, Rei said one evening, the whole household gathered for a meal that finally felt substantial enough to call a proper dinner rather than careful rationing, and Haven barely resembles what it was a year ago. I keep thinking about how different all our lives would look right now if you'd never found any of us. I try not to think about that version too much, Izuku admitted. It doesn't do anyone any good, dwelling on the futures we managed to avoid instead of building the one we actually have. You should let yourself be proud of it anyway, Mitsuki said, blunt as ever, though something warmer than her usual sharpness colored the words. Whatever this whole thing eventually turns into, you should know already that it's more than most people ever manage to build in a lifetime, let alone in a year. Izuku looked around the table at the three of them, Nana with her fierce, protective steadiness, Rei with her quiet, meticulous care, Mitsuki with her hard-won, unguarded warmth finally beginning to show through, and felt something settle in his chest that he suspected he would carry for the rest of whatever strange, borrowed life this fractured Quirk had handed him. He had come to this decade with nothing, a stranded boy with a broken power and no plan beyond the vague, desperate hope of doing some good before finding a way home, if a way home even existed. He had not expected to find, instead, something that felt increasingly like a family of his own making, for stones laid deliberately against a history that had never given any of them the chance to choose for themselves before now. For stones, he said quietly, echoing Nana's old word for what they were building. And still more names out there, probably, that we haven't found yet. But 4 is a good start. 4 is more than I ever let myself hope for, back when it was just me and a burned-out building and a lot of uncertainty about whether any of this would work at all. The collector's grudge. The man who had come to the village twice now to claim what he believed was owed to him did not simply let the matter rest, though it took him several months to act on the slow, simmering resentment of having been refused a second time by people he had once considered an easy, unremarkable acquisition. He was not a man of great institutional power, not compared to the patient, terrible ambitions of someone like the collector Izuku had first encountered in an alley, but he had money, and connections among others who traded in the same ugly business, and he began, quietly, to ask questions of his own about the strangers who had twice interfered with his plans. It did not take him terribly long to learn a fragment of what he was looking for, a rumor traveling the coast about a fisherman's daughter who had similarly vanished from a wealthy family's grasp under strange circumstances involving a boy and a girl matching descriptions uncomfortably similar to the ones who had cost him Mitsuki. He began, with the same patient, methodical attention that had built his unpleasant trade in the first place, to trace the rumor backward, town by town, toward whatever source might eventually lead him to the people responsible for costing him not one valuable acquisition but apparently 2. He did not yet know about Haven. He did not yet know its location, or its full purpose, or the growing number of people who called its reinforced walls home. But he had begun, in his own smaller and less patient way, to gather threads of his own, and somewhere in the gap between his petty, wounded pride and the vast, patient ambition of a man not yet called all for one who had also begun quietly tracking the same strange boy's movements, the shape of a much larger reckoning had begun, slowly and invisibly, to take form. Izuku did not know any of this yet, standing at Haven's entrance one warm evening with Nana, Rei, and Mitsuki gathered comfortably nearby, watching the sun set over walls that had grown, in barely a year, from a burned-out ruin into something that finally deserved to be called a home. He knew only that the future remained unwritten in ways both wonderful and dangerous, that every name he managed to reach in time meant one more life pulled free of a history that had never asked permission before deciding its shape, and that somewhere out there, in this vast, half-mapped decade, more names were surely still waiting, unaware that a stranger from a future they were helping to build had already decided, with the same stubborn, unshakable resolve that had carried him through every impossible day since a burning pier had thrown him backward through time, that he was not going to stop looking for them. Letters home. Rei's mother wrote twice that year, careful letters carried by a merchant who traveled the coast road regularly enough to serve as an informal courier, and Izuku watched Rei read each one with a mixture of joy and quiet grief that he recognized from his own life, the particular ache of loving people you had left behind for good reason and missing them anyway despite knowing the distance kept everyone safer. The letters spoke mostly of small things, the village, the fishing season, a father slowly working through his own guilt in the careful, halting way of a man unused to admitting fault, and each one ended with the same simple, steady reassurance, that Rei's mother was proud of the life her daughter was building, however far from home it had taken her. She wants to visit, Rei said one afternoon, folding the latest letter carefully back into its envelope. Not yet. She says the roads still feel too watched for now, with the Todoroki family's pride still smarting over losing the arrangement. But eventually. She wants to see this place with her own eyes again, now that it's grown into something more than the half-built shelter she left me in. She'll be proud, Nana said confidently. You've turned one of the extra rooms into something that actually looks like it belongs to someone who lives there on purpose instead of someone just surviving in it. That's not a small thing. Mitsuki, listening from where she sat mending a length of rope with more patience than Izuku would have credited her with a year ago, spoke up with the blunt observation that had become one of her more endearing qualities. You know what's strange, she said, is that all four of us came from completely different kinds of danger, and somehow we all ended up needing exactly the same thing in the end. Somewhere safe enough that we could stop bracing for the next blow long enough to actually build something. That's not strange, Izuku said quietly. That's the whole point of what Haven is supposed to be. It doesn't matter what specific shape the danger took. What matters is that nobody deserves to spend their whole life just surviving it, when they could be building something instead. The conversation drifted on into the comfortable, ordinary rhythms of an evening among people who had learned, slowly and deliberately, to trust each other with the full weight of their own histories, and Izuku found himself, not for the first time, marveling at how far this strange, borrowed life had carried him from the boy who had washed up gasping on unfamiliar pavement with nothing but a ruined costume and a waterlogged notebook. He had not found his way home yet, had not found any indication that a way home even existed for a quirk as fractured as his own. But sitting here, surrounded by the family he had built instead of the one he had left behind, he found that the absence of a clear path home bothered him considerably less than it once had. What comes next? That night, once the others had gone to sleep, Izuku sat alone at Haven's entrance the way he often did, notebook open on his knee, adding careful new notes to the tangled record of names and fragments and half-remembered history he had been keeping since his first night stranded in this era. Nana's page was full now, dense with details he had once needed to remember and now simply knew by heart. Rei's page held the careful record of a rescue completed, a family reunited across distance instead of torn apart by proximity. Mitsuki's page was newer, still filling in, a story still being written rather than one he had simply redirected from a version he already knew. He turned to a blank page and considered, for a long moment, what might come next. There were other names, he suspected, other futures out there in this vast, unwritten decade that history had left to chance the first time around, and he did not yet know how many of them he would find, or how much of what he thought he remembered about their fates would prove accurate once he actually reached them. He thought of the collector who had twice tried to claim Mitsuki, still out there somewhere, wounded pride festering into something that might eventually demand a reckoning. He thought of the patient, terrible man in the alley who had noticed him once already and would, Izuku suspected, notice him again eventually, in circumstances that would not end as easily as a single stolen rescue in a rainy lane. He did not know exactly what shape those future confrontations would take. He knew only that Haven, for stones deep and growing, was stronger for every person who chose to help carry it, and that whatever came next, he would not be facing it alone the way he had faced that first terrified night in a condemned building with nothing but a scared child and a fire built from scavenged wood. He closed the notebook, banked the fire for the night, and went inside to sleep, carrying with him the same quiet, stubborn resolve that had carried him through every impossible day since a burning pier had first thrown him backward through time. Tomorrow there would be more walls to reinforce, more supplies to gather, more careful, patient work in the unglamorous business of building something meant to outlast him. And somewhere out there, in towns and villages he had not yet reached, more names were waiting, unaware that a boy with a broken quirk and an unbreakable resolve had already decided he was not finished looking for them. The shape of a sanctuary. In the weeks that followed, Haven took on a rhythm that felt, for the first time since its founding, less like a shelter braced against emergency and more like an actual community settling into its own natural order. Mitsuki's father, once he had fully thrown himself into the work of expansion, proved to have an instinct for building that went well beyond simple carpentry, sketching out rough plans for a second structure that could eventually house more arrivals without crowding the original walls, and Izuku found himself, more than once, simply standing back and watching with quiet astonishment as people who had arrived here as rescues transformed, one deliberate choice at a time, into people who were actively building something larger than their own survival. It was Mitsuki's mother who suggested, one evening over the kind of full, comfortable dinner that had become normal rather than remarkable, that Haven needed a garden, practical reasoning wrapped around something that Izuku suspected was really about permanence, about planting something that would take seasons to grow and therefore assumed, by its very nature, that they intended to stay long enough to see it bear fruit. They cleared a section of the lot the following week, all 6 of them working together in the kind of easy, wordless cooperation that Izuku had once only read about in old stories of found families, and by the time the first seeds went into the turned earth, something in the atmosphere of the place had shifted permanently, from a shelter people had fled to towards something people had genuinely chosen to build a life around. Nana, watching the garden take shape with her usual sharp, assessing attention, voiced the thought that had clearly been building in several of them for a while. "This isn't just going to be 4 names anymore, is it?" she said. "Or 5, counting Mitsuki's whole family properly. Eventually this is going to be dozens of people, maybe more, all needing somewhere that actually works, not just somewhere that used to be a burned-out factory with good intentions holding the walls up." "I've been thinking about that too," Izuku admitted. "We're going to need real systems eventually. Not just the 4 of us, or 6 of us, making every decision around a fire at night. Something more lasting. Something that could keep running even if something happened to any one of us individually." "That sounds like you're already planning for a future you're not sure you'll be around to see," Ray said, watching him carefully, and Izuku realized, with some surprise, that she had caught something in his own voice that he had not fully admitted to himself yet. "I don't know how long I have here," he said slowly. "I don't know if there's a way home, or if this fractured quirk of mine was always meant to be a one-way trip. I try not to dwell on it too much, because dwelling on it doesn't change anything either way. But I think, if I'm going to spend whatever time I have here building something, I want it built well enough that it doesn't depend entirely on me still being around to hold it together. I want it to be able to outlast all of us, if it has to." The table went quiet for a moment, the weight of that admission settling over all of them, and it was Mitsuki, characteristically, who broke the silence first, with the same blunt, fierce warmth that had become one of her most valuable contributions to the household. "Then we build it that way," she said simply. "Together. Starting now, instead of waiting until we have to." And around the table, one by one, the others nodded, and the quiet, ordinary evening carried on, for rescues and a family turned 6, all of them bent toward the same slow, patient work of building something meant to last far longer than any single person's presence within its walls. A season of quiet. The second year at Haven passed more gently than the first, and Izuku found himself, more than once, faintly suspicious of how gently, the way a person who has spent long enough bracing for disaster learns to distrust even genuine calm. Mitsuki's family had settled fully into the rhythm of the place, her father's carpentry steadily expanding the second structure they had planned the previous spring, her mother's organizational instincts turning Haven's modest stores into something that ran with real efficiency. Mitsuki herself had softened by fractions, still sharp-tongued and quick-tempered in the ways that made her who she was, but steadier now, less braced for a blow that no longer seemed to be coming. Word of Haven had begun, carefully and quietly, to spread beyond the small circle who already knew it existed, not through any deliberate effort on Izuku's part but through the slow, organic drift of rumor among people who understood, instinctively, which secrets were worth protecting. A young man with a minor but stigmatized quirk arrived that spring, having heard from a merchant's careful, roundabout mention that there was a place in the north where such things were not held against a person. An older woman, widowed and turned out by in-laws who resented the strength of her quirk, found her way to Haven's door in early summer, guided by nothing more than the same quiet network of dockworkers and merchants Nana had spent 2 years carefully cultivating. Each new arrival meant new negotiations, new adjustments to the fledgling systems Izuku, Rei, Nana, and Mitsuki had begun building the previous spring, and Izuku found the work more satisfying than he had expected, the patient, unglamorous business of turning good intentions into something that actually functioned. They drafted a simple rotation for shared labor. They expanded the garden a second time. They built, board by board, a modest structure meant specifically for new arrivals to have privacy and rest before being asked to contribute anything at all, a small kindness that Rei had insisted on, remembering, Izuku suspected, her own first exhausted days at Haven the year before. "It's strange," Rei said one evening, watching the newest arrival settle into the communal dinner with the same wary uncertainty she remembered feeling herself, "how much this place has already outgrown what any of us imagined when we first laid these walls." "Good strange, though," Nana said firmly. "The kind of strange that means it's working." Izuku, watching from across the room as Mitsuki patiently walked the widowed newcomer through Haven's simple house rules, framed and hung by the entrance since the previous winter, felt the same quiet, humbled satisfaction he had felt watching Rei's mother embrace her daughter goodbye, the particular pride of watching something built from nothing take on a life larger than the hands that had first shaped it. Threads drawing tight. Far to the south, in a modest but comfortable office above a shipping concern he used as a legitimate front for considerably less legitimate business, the collector who had twice failed to claim Mitsuki pored over a set of careful notes his hired investigators had spent the better part of a year assembling. He was not a patient man by nature, but wounded pride had taught him a patience he did not otherwise possess, and the notes in front of him represented 18 months of quiet, methodical work tracing rumors of a strange boy and his growing circle of rescued girls across 3 separate provinces. He had learned, by careful inference rather than any single confirmed source, that the boy operated from somewhere in the north, likely a fixed location rather than continuous travel, given how consistently rumors of his activities seemed to radiate outward from roughly the same region. He had learned that the boy's circle had grown beyond the original handful he had first heard about, that whatever place they called home had begun, quietly, to take in others beyond the specific girls the boy seemed to be searching for. And he had learned, most usefully of all, the rough shape of the trade routes and travel patterns that connected this mysterious sanctuary to the wider world, patterns that, given enough patience and enough coin spread among the right merchants, might eventually be narrowed down to an actual location. He was under no illusion that he could simply walk in and reclaim what he considered rightfully his, not after twice witnessing firsthand how capably the boy and his growing family defended themselves. But he had connections of his own, men in his trade who dealt in exactly the kind of coercive, well-organized violence that a modest sanctuary defended by determined amateurs might not be prepared to withstand, and he had begun, in the past several months, quiet conversations with several of them about the potential value of a coordinated effort against a target that, by every account he had gathered, held considerably more promising quirks in one place than any single acquisition he had ever previously attempted. It would take more time yet to gather the resources and the certainty he wanted before committing to such an effort. But time, unlike pride, was something he still had in reasonable supply, and he intended to spend it well. A warning on the wind. The first sign of real trouble came not from the collector himself but from a source Izuku had not expected, a nervous, apologetic merchant who arrived at Haven's outer gate one overcast afternoon asking, in a low, careful voice, for whoever was in charge of the place. "I've traded honestly with your people for the better part of a year," the merchant said, once Izuku had brought him inside and offered him something warm to drink, his hand still faintly trembling around the cup. "I wouldn't come all this way to cause trouble. But I've heard things lately, in the taverns further south, that I thought you ought to know, given how well you've always treated my family's business." He told them, haltingly, about the questions that had begun circulating among certain less reputable merchants over the past several months, careful, well-funded questions about a settlement somewhere in the north known for taking in young Quirk users, about trade routes and travel patterns that might lead a determined investigator toward its exact location. He did not know who was asking, exactly, only that the coin behind the questions was substantial enough that several merchants he knew personally had already sold whatever fragments of information they possessed without much hesitation at all. "I didn't sell anything," the merchant said, with a kind of anxious pride. "But I can't promise everyone else held the same line. Money like that tends to loosen tongues that would otherwise stay shut." Izuku felt the old, familiar cold settle into his chest, the same dread that had first taken root in an alley 2 years ago and had never fully left him since, and he thanked the merchant with genuine, weighted gratitude before calling Nana, Rei, and Mitsuki together once the man had departed, back toward the safety of returning home before dark. "It's him," Mitsuki said flatly, once Izuku had relayed the warning. "It has to be. He's had 2 years to nurse that grudge, and he clearly hasn't let it go." "Or it's someone else entirely," Rei said, though without much conviction. "But given everything we already know about the kind of men who trade in quirks like property, I think we'd be foolish to assume it's anyone less dangerous than the worst possibility." Nana, who had spent 2 years building the very network of contacts that had just delivered this warning, looked grimly satisfied despite the circumstances. "Good thing we've spent all this time making friends instead of just staying hidden," she said. A network that can carry a warning to us can carry warnings the other direction too, if we use it carefully. We'll know if he gets close long before he actually reaches these walls. That buys us time, Izuku said, but it doesn't solve the actual problem. Eventually, if he's determined enough, he's going to find this place, or find someone willing to lead him here for the right price. We need to decide, now, what Haven does when that day actually comes. Preparing the walls. The weeks that followed transformed Haven in ways Izuku had not anticipated needing so soon. He drew on every fragment of hero training he still remembered, adapting rescue and defense drills meant for a world of licensed heroes and organized agencies into something that could be taught, patiently and without panic, to a household of frightened newcomers and hardened veterans alike. Mitsuki's father, whose carpentry skills had already reshaped Haven's physical structure once, turned his attention now to reinforcing weak points in the perimeter, narrow approaches that could be defended by few against many, sightlines cleared so that no one could approach unseen. Ray, methodical as ever, organized the household into careful shifts, ensuring that Haven was never without at least one capable defender awake and alert regardless of the hour, while Nana expanded her network further still, recruiting a small, trusted circle of townsfolk willing to send word the moment any suspicious inquiry reached their ears. Mitsuki threw herself into combat drills with a fierce, focused intensity that reminded Izuku, more than once, of his own frantic training in the months before his first provisional license, the particular energy of someone determined not to be caught unprepared a second time by a danger she had already faced once before. "We're not soldiers," Izuku reminded the household one evening, watching the results of weeks of drilling with a complicated mixture of pride and unease. "I don't want anyone here thinking this is what Haven is supposed to be about. We're not building an army. We're just making sure that if trouble finds us, we're ready to protect what we've built without losing it. There's a difference between being ready to fight and wanting to," the newly arrived widow said quietly, from where she sat mending a torn shirt with the same careful attention Ray had once brought to her own first weeks at Haven. "I think everyone here understands that difference well enough, given what most of us have already survived to get here in the first place." Izuku nodded, grateful for the reminder, and turned his attention back to the careful, unglamorous work of preparation, reinforcing not just Haven's physical walls but the deeper, more important foundation beneath them, the shared understanding among everyone who called this place home that whatever came for them, they would face it together rather than scattered and alone. It was Mitsuki, 3 weeks into their preparations, who first spotted the unfamiliar rider on the road below Haven's Ridge, watching from her post with the sharp, unblinking attention she brought to everything that mattered, and it was her voice, raised in a clear, carrying warning cry, that first alerted the household that whatever careful preparation they had managed was about to be tested considerably sooner than any of them had hoped. The rider on the ridge. The rider turned out, on closer inspection through the modest spyglass Nana had traded for the previous winter, to be a single scout rather than the vanguard of any larger force, a lean, watchful man surveying Haven's walls from a careful distance with the unmistakable posture of someone gathering information rather than preparing an immediate assault. Izuku's stomach tightened at the sight of him regardless. A single scout meant, almost certainly, that whoever had sent him was still in the planning stages, weighing Haven's defenses before committing to anything more direct, and that meant the true test was still ahead of them rather than already arrived. "We could catch him," Mitsuki said, already tense with the coiled readiness of someone eager to act rather than simply wait. "Corner him before he gets back to report whatever he's seen. And confirm to whoever sent him that we're exactly as dangerous and prepared as he probably already suspects," Ray said, more measured. "I understand the impulse. But I think there's more value right now in letting him report back that we're simply an ordinary, well-kept settlement, nothing worth the risk of a costly assault, than in proving we're formidable enough to be worth extra caution." Izuku turned this over carefully, weighing the same tactical calculations he had once made in hero training exercises against the much higher stakes of an actual community's safety. "Ray's right," he finally said. "We don't move against him. We let him watch, we make sure nothing he sees gives away just how prepared we actually are, and we keep gathering our own information in the meantime. If they're still scouting rather than attacking, we still have time to prepare more thoroughly, and time is worth more to us right now than the satisfaction of chasing off one scout." The rider lingered through the following 2 days, watching from a careful distance that never quite crossed into Haven's more heavily defended perimeter, before finally turning his horse and departing back the way he had come, and the household exhaled, collectively, though the tension did not fully leave any of them, the awareness settling instead into something more permanent, the understanding that the quiet, careful life they had built here now existed under the shadow of an approaching reckoning they could delay but not indefinitely avoid. "He'll report back that we look ordinary," Nana said, once the rider had fully disappeared from view. "Ordinary and well kept, not fortified, not obviously dangerous. That should buy us more time before anyone decides we're worth the cost of a real assault." "Should," Izuku agreed. "But we plan as though it won't. We've come too far to risk everything on an assumption about what one scout chooses to report." The night they came. The assault, when it finally came nearly 2 months later, arrived not in the daylight caution of a single scout but in the deliberate cover of a moonless night, a dozen hired men moving in careful, coordinated silence toward Haven's perimeter with the practiced competence of people who did this kind of work for a living rather than out of any particular conviction. Izuku had feared, in the weeks of waiting since the scout's departure, that his household's untested defenses would crumble against genuine professional violence, and it was only the accumulated weight of months of careful preparation, the cleared sightlines, the practiced shifts, the quiet, unglamorous discipline of people who had chosen readiness over panic, that kept that fear from becoming reality. Nana's warning network gave them nearly an hour's notice, a runner from town arriving breathless with word that armed men had been spotted moving north along the coast road in numbers too large for any innocent purpose, and by the time the first hired men reached Haven's outer perimeter, they found not the vulnerable, undefended settlement they had likely expected but a household fully roused and positioned, every capable adult and several of the older children arrayed according to a plan they had drilled dozens of times over the preceding months. Izuku met the first wave near the narrow, deliberately constructed choke point at Haven's main approach, his own quirk finally proving useful in a way it had not been since that first desperate night in the alley, small precise reversals undoing a swung blade before it connected, resetting a companion's twisted ankle mid-retreat, buying crucial seconds again and again in the controlled, deliberate way he had spent 2 years slowly relearning to trust. Beside him, Mitsuki fought with a ferocity that reminded him, achingly, of a boy not yet born who would one day inherit her fire, controlled explosive bursts driving back 3 men at once without ever losing the discipline of her aim. Ray's careful ice work froze the ground beneath advancing boots, turning confident footing treacherous in an instant, while Nana, no longer the frightened child from the alley but a formidable young woman in her own right, unleashed static charges precise enough to disable rather than merely wound. The fight was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided in a direction the attackers had clearly not anticipated, and within 20 minutes the hired men, having lost the element of surprise and finding themselves facing a defense considerably more organized and capable than any reasonable assessment could have predicted, began the ragged, disorganized retreat of professionals who had been paid to take a calculated risk rather than to die for someone else's grudge. Izuku watched them go, breathing hard, adrenaline still hammering through him, and felt, beneath the exhaustion, a fierce and complicated relief. Haven had held. The people he loved had held. But somewhere out there, in the dark beyond the retreating men, the man who had ordered this assault remained free to try again, and Izuku understood, with grim clarity, that tonight's victory had bought them time rather than safety. Counting the cost. Dawn found Haven's household gathered in the central room, exhausted, bruised, and grimly grateful that the fighting had ended with no deaths on either side, a mercy that Izuku suspected owed as much to his own careful, restrained approach to their preparation as to any luck. Several of the newer arrivals, thrust into their first real confrontation with the kind of danger they had fled to Haven to escape, sat pale and shaking, and Izuku spent a considerable part of the morning simply sitting with them, offering the same steady, patient presence he had once offered a terrified 9-year-old in an alley 2 years and a lifetime ago. "We held," Ray said quietly, once the immediate aftermath had settled into something more manageable, tending a shallow cut along Mitsuki's forearm with careful, practiced hands. "That matters. Whatever comes next, we proved tonight that Haven can actually defend itself, not just in theory but when it actually counted. We held this time," Mitsuki said, wincing slightly as Ray finished the bandage. Doesn't mean he won't come back with more men next time, or better ones, once he realizes a dozen hired hands weren't enough. Then we prepare for that too, Nana said, though her usual fierce confidence had a harder, more sober edge to it this morning, the plain acknowledgement of a young woman who had just watched her found family fight for their lives and did not intend to let the relief of surviving one assault dull her vigilance against the next. We reinforce what worked. We fix what didn't. And we keep building our network, so we have even more warning next time than we had this time. Izuku, moving among the gathered household checking on injuries and offering what reassurance he could, found himself thinking, not for the first time, of the strange and terrible arithmetic of the life he had built here. Every rescue, every name saved from a history that would have ground them down unremarked, came bundled together with new dangers that history had never had to account for either, because history, in its original unaltered shape, had simply let these people fall, and falling, however tragic, had never drawn the kind of organized, violent attention that saving them apparently now did. He did not regret a single choice that had brought them to this morning. But he understood, with clear-eyed and sober honesty, that the path ahead would only grow more dangerous the more good he managed to do, and he owed it to everyone who had chosen to build a life within these walls to prepare them fully for that reality rather than let hope alone carry the weight of it. A reckoning postponed. Word of the failed assault reached the collector nearly 2 weeks later, delivered by the ragged, chastened remnants of the men he had hired, and the report they gave him, of a settlement far better organized and defended than any reasonable estimate could have predicted, left him sitting alone in his office for a long time afterward, turning the problem over with a mixture of frustration and, grudgingly, a kind of wary respect he had not expected to feel toward a boy who had once cost him a single promising acquisition in a rural village. He was not, whatever his failings, a man inclined to throw good resources after bad without careful reconsideration, and the calculus that had once seemed simple, a wounded pride demanding satisfaction, a valuable quirk worth reclaiming, now felt considerably more complicated against the reality of a fortified settlement willing and able to defend itself with lethal competence. He did not abandon the grudge entirely. Men in his particular trade rarely forgot a loss so thoroughly. But he set the matter aside for the time being, filing it away among other unresolved ambitions, patient in his own smaller, more petty way, waiting for circumstances to shift more favorably before committing further resources to a target that had already cost him considerably more than he had initially expected to spend. Far to the north, unaware of exactly how much uncertainty his household's stubborn defense had bought them, Izuku spent the following months in the steady, unglamorous work of consolidation, reinforcing what had held, repairing what had not, and slowly, carefully, expanding Haven's careful network of allies further still, until the quiet settlement in the north had become, without any single dramatic announcement, one of the most well-protected sanctuaries for endangered quirk users in the entire region, known by careful whisper among those who needed such knowledge and studiously ignored by those who did not. It was, Izuku reflected one quiet evening, watching the garden Mitsuki's mother had first suggested now bearing its second full harvest, the closest thing to victory that a life like his seemed built to offer, not a single dramatic triumph but a long, patient accumulation of small, hard-won stability, each season adding another layer of strength to a foundation that, however far from finished, had already proven itself sturdy enough to weather a genuine storm. A shadow's patience. News of a mysterious northern settlement successfully repelling a coordinated assault traveled further than Izuku might have expected, filtering through the same underground channels that connected criminals, information brokers, and the various unsavory men who traded in stolen quirks across the region, and it was through one such channel, several months after the fact, that the story eventually reached the ears of a man who had never stopped, in the intervening years, quietly tracking fragments of information about a strange boy with an unusual, time-bending quirk. He read the second-hand account with the same patient, methodical attention he brought to everything that interested him, noting details that a less careful reader might have dismissed as incidental, the coordinated defense, the disciplined restraint that had left attackers alive rather than dead despite clear tactical advantage, the sense of an organization built not around a single powerful individual but around a genuine, functioning community. It painted a picture considerably more sophisticated than he had initially estimated from a single encounter in a rainy alley years before, and it deepened, rather than diminished, his patient curiosity about exactly what this stranger from nowhere was quietly building in the north. He did not act on this information immediately. He had, as always, more pressing concerns closer to home, ambitions decades in the making that required careful tending, and a single unusual settlement in the north, however intriguing, did not yet represent a priority worth diverting significant resources toward. But he made another careful note, filed alongside the first, and allowed himself, in the quiet privacy of his own calculating mind, a small measure of anticipation. Whatever this boy was building, it was clearly built to last, and men who built things meant to last were, in his considerable experience, either valuable allies waiting to be properly courted, or genuine threats worth removing before they grew large enough to matter. He had not yet decided which category this particular stranger would ultimately fall into. He suspected, given enough time, the boy himself would eventually make that decision for him. New faces at the table. Haven's slow, steady growth continued through the following year, each new arrival bringing its own small story of a danger narrowly avoided or a hardship quietly endured, and Izuku found himself, more and more, stepping back from the role of sole founder and into something closer to one voice among many in an increasingly capable, self-sustaining community. Ray had taken to training newer arrivals in the practical skills of running a household at scale, patient and thorough in a way that reminded Izuku, with real fondness, of the very first weeks she had spent proving to herself that this new life could bear her full weight. Mitsuki, unexpectedly, had become something of an informal captain of Haven's defense, organizing drills and perimeter checks with a discipline that surprised no one who had watched her grow steadily more purposeful over the preceding 2 years. Nana, meanwhile, had begun quietly training a handful of the community's older children and teenagers in the careful, patient work of gathering information and cultivating trustworthy contacts, passing on the same skills that had once turned a frightened orphan into Haven's most valuable early asset. Watching her teach a lanky, serious boy named Kenji how to read a merchant's body language for signs of dishonesty, Izuku felt a familiar swell of quiet pride, the particular satisfaction of watching someone he had once carried through a burning alley become, in her own right, a mentor capable of carrying others. "We're not just surviving anymore," Ray observed one evening, watching the full household gather for a meal that had grown, over 3 years, from a cramped fire between 2 people into a genuine communal table crowded with faces from a dozen different corners of the region. "We're actually thriving. I don't think any of us quite believed that was possible, back when we first arrived here. I still don't quite believe it, some days," Mitsuki admitted, with more open vulnerability than she would have shown a year earlier. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Old habit, I suppose. Maybe it will, eventually," Izuku said honestly, unwilling to offer false comfort even in a moment of genuine celebration. "I don't think either of the men who've noticed us are finished being a problem, not really. But I think we've proven, this past year especially, that whatever drops, we're strong enough now to catch it together instead of being crushed by it alone." A new name. It was the widow, Setsuko, who first mentioned the name that would come to occupy Izuku's attention for months afterward, offered almost in passing one evening as the household discussed the various small dangers still facing Quirk users across the region, dangers that Haven's growing network had made them increasingly aware of even in places far beyond their own immediate reach. "There's a story going around the eastern provinces," Setsuko said, "about a family of considerable standing who lost their fortune rather suddenly a few years back, and now train their remaining children harder than seems reasonable, hoping one of them develops a quirk powerful enough to restore what they lost. I heard it from a trader who passed through here last month. He mentioned one daughter in particular, still quite young, whose quirk apparently manifested early and strong, and who the family has already begun treating less like a child and more like an investment they intend to see returns on." Izuku felt the old, familiar tightening in his chest that had accompanied every new name since Nana's, the particular unease of recognizing, even second-hand and unconfirmed, the shape of a danger he had encountered too many times now to mistake for anything else. He did not recognize the specific family Setsuko described, nor any name attached to the daughter in question, but something in the pattern, a family's desperation transforming a child's gift into a burden she had never asked to carry, felt uncomfortably familiar against everything he had already witnessed in this decade. "Do you have a name?" he asked. "Or a region, at least, more specific than the eastern provinces generally." Not much more than that, I'm afraid, Setsuko admitted. Traders aren't always precise about such things, and I didn't think to press him further at the time. But if it's the kind of thing you and the others usually investigate, I imagine your network could narrow it down further, given enough time and the right questions asked in the right places. Nana, listening with the sharp, immediate focus she brought to any potential new thread, was already turning the fragment over with visible interest. Eastern provinces, considerable former standing, a family training their children hard for a quirk they're hoping restores their fortune. That's specific enough to start with. I can put out careful inquiries through the same channels we've used before. Izuku looked around the table at the household that had grown, over 3 patient years, from a single desperate rescue into something considerably larger and more capable, and felt the same fierce, familiar resolve settle over him that had first taken root the night he pulled a terrified 9-year-old out of an alley and decided, without fully understanding the scope of what he was committing to, that he would not let history repeat its oldest cruelties unchallenged. Then let's find out what we're actually dealing with, he said, before it becomes something we wish we had moved on sooner. What Haven has become. That night, once the household had settled and the usual quiet rhythms of Haven's evening had wound down into rest, Izuku found himself once again at the entrance where he had spent so many nights before, notebook open, adding careful new details to a fragment of a name that might, in time, become the 5th stone laid against a history he had already reshaped considerably more than he had ever imagined possible on that first terrified night stranded in an unfamiliar era. He thought of the boy who had washed up gasping on unfamiliar pavement 3 years ago now, soaked through, alone, with nothing but a ruined costume and a waterlogged notebook and a desperate, uncertain hope that he might somehow find a way to do some good before finding his way home, if a way home even existed at all. That boy could not have imagined this, the garden now in its 3rd full harvest, the careful rotation of shared labor that kept a household of nearly 30 people fed and sheltered, the framed set of simple principles by the entrance that had grown, over 3 years, from a hopeful draft into something closer to a genuine, tested creed. He could not have imagined Rei's steady, meticulous care, or Mitsuki's fierce, hard-won warmth, or Nana's transformation from a frightened child into a mentor capable of shaping the next generation of Haven's careful, patient network. He thought, too, of the danger still circling beyond Haven's walls, a wounded collector who had not fully abandoned his grudge, a patient, terrible man who had noticed him once and would, Izuku suspected, notice him again eventually in circumstances considerably more consequential than a single stolen rescue in a rainy alley. He did not know what shape those future confrontations would ultimately take, or whether Haven's growing strength would prove sufficient to weather them when they came. But he knew, closing his notebook and looking out at the quiet, moonlit shape of the community he had built from nothing, that whatever came next, he would face it surrounded by people who had chosen, deliberately and without condition, to build something lasting alongside him. Somewhere in the eastern provinces, a girl he had never met carried a quirk her own family had already begun to see as a debt to be collected rather than a gift to be cherished, unaware that a stranger from a future she was helping to shape had already decided, with the same stubborn, unshakable resolve that had carried him through every impossible day since a burning pier had first thrown him backward through time, that her story did not have to end the way history had originally written it. The weight of founding. In the quiet weeks that followed Setsuko's fragment of a lead, Izuku found himself grappling with a question he had managed, mostly, to avoid confronting directly in the 3 years since his arrival, a question that Rei, with her characteristic gentle perceptiveness, finally gave voice to one evening as the two of them worked together mending a section of fence along Haven's eastern perimeter. "You carry every name like it's yours alone to save," she said, not unkindly, tying off a length of wire with practiced hands. "Nana's rescue. Mine. Mitsuki's. Now this new girl in the eastern provinces, whoever she turns out to be. I've watched you take each one onto your own shoulders as though the rest of us are simply along for the journey rather than equally responsible for what Haven has become." Izuku paused in his work, considering the observation with the same careful honesty he tried to bring to everything Rei said to him, since she rarely spoke without having turned a thought over thoroughly first. "I suppose I do," he admitted. "I think it's because I'm the one who came here knowing things the rest of you couldn't have known, the one fragment of unfair advantage in all of this." It feels like the responsibility for using that advantage well should sit more heavily on me than on anyone who didn't have it to begin with. That's a kind way of thinking about it, Ray said, but I don't think it's a true one, not anymore. You knew a name and a rough danger when you found me. You did not know how to convince my father, or how to comfort my mother, or how to build the actual trust that got me safely out of that arrangement. That was all of us, together, the same as it's been with every rescue since. I think you're allowed to have started this alone, Izuku, but I don't think you're required to keep carrying it that way. 3 years, and a dozen new faces later. Izuku was quiet for a long moment, turning her words over with the same careful attention he gave everything that unsettled a belief he had not realized he was still holding on to quite so tightly. I don't know how to let go of that instinct, he finally admitted. It's been mine since the very first night, watching Nana shake by a fire I'd built from scavenged wood, deciding I couldn't let anyone else fall through the cracks history had left open for them. I'm not sure that instinct knows how to share the weight, even when I want it to. Then let us teach it, Ray said simply, setting down her tools and looking at him with the same quiet, steady warmth that had first drawn Izuku's attention to her on a seawall 3 years earlier, a girl carefully shaping frost into the shape of a life she had finally been allowed to choose for herself. You didn't build Haven alone, whatever your notebook full of names might tell you. You built it with us. Let that be true in how you carry it too, not just in how it actually happened. Izuku looked at her for a long moment, feeling something in his chest loosen slightly, an old, private burden shifting to make room for the plain, undeniable truth of everything Haven had become in the years since a terrified boy first decided, alone in a condemned building, that he would try to save a handful of names history had never given a fair chance. He was not alone in that effort anymore, had not been for a long time now. However stubbornly some quiet part of him still insisted on carrying it that way. All right, he said, and meant it. Together, then. Whatever comes next, for this new girl, and for whatever names come after her. Ray smiled, the same small, genuine smile she had first offered him around a fire in Haven's earliest, most uncertain days, and together they finished the length of fence in comfortable, companionable silence, 2 founders among many now, building something that had long since stopped depending on any single pair of hands to hold it steady. East, before winter. They decided, in the end, to wait until Nana's careful inquiries had narrowed the fragment of a lead into something solid enough to act on, rather than rushing east on rumor alone the way Izuku's earliest instincts might once have pushed him to. It took the better part of 2 months, letters and quiet conversations passed carefully along Nana's network of trusted merchants and dockworkers, before a name finally surfaced, tentative but promising, a household in a provincial capital 2 weeks' travel to the east, once wealthy, now quietly desperate, with a daughter whose quirk had reportedly manifested young and strong enough to draw exactly the kind of attention Izuku had learned to fear on behalf of children who had never asked for it. We should go before winter closes the eastern passes, Mitsuki said, studying the rough map Nana had assembled from months of careful gathering. If we wait until spring, that's another half year of a family treating a child like an investment instead of a daughter. I don't love the idea of leaving that be, even a season longer than we have to. I agree, Izuku said, but we go carefully this time, more carefully than we've gone before. Haven is bigger now, and it can run without all 3 of us gone at once. I think it's time we started thinking about these journeys differently, not as something the founders drop everything to handle alone, but as something the whole community shares the planning and the risk of. It was decided, after some discussion, that Izuku and Mitsuki would make the journey east together, while Ray remained at Haven to oversee its continued operation alongside Nana, who would keep the network of information flowing in both directions throughout their absence. It was a small change, but it felt, to Izuku, like an important one, proof of Ray's gentle insistence finally taking root, the quiet, deliberate choice to let Haven's growing strength carry some of the weight he had once assumed only he could carry alone. They set out 3 days later, the last clear stretch of autumn weather holding just long enough to make the early miles of the journey east feel almost peaceful, and Izuku found himself, walking the familiar rhythm of a long road once again, thinking of every name that had led him to this exact moment. Nana's fierce, steady courage, Ray's quiet, meticulous care, Mitsuki's hard-won warmth walking now at his side toward a 4th stranger's uncertain future. Whatever waited for them in the provincial capital 2 weeks ahead, He found that he no longer faced it with the desperate, solitary resolve of a boy who had washed up alone on unfamiliar pavement 3 years before. He faced it instead as one part of something considerably larger than himself, a sanctuary built stone by patient stone, still growing, still reaching, toward every name history had once been allowed to let fall. What Rei held together. While Izuku and Mitsuki made their way east, Haven settled into the capable hands of Rei and Nana with a smoothness that surprised even Izuku. Watching from a distance he could only measure by the careful, reassuring letters Nana managed to send back along the same network she had built to warn them of danger. Rei took to the role of steward with the same quiet, thorough discipline she brought to everything, settling disputes between newer arrivals with patient fairness, overseeing the final preparations for winter with an efficiency that left the household stores fuller than they had been in any previous year, and finding, in the process, a confidence in her own leadership that had been growing steadily since the earliest days of her own rescue but had never before been tested quite so directly. "You'd think," she said to Nana one evening, reviewing the household supplies by lamplight, "that after everything, I'd still feel like the frightened girl on the sea wall whenever something like this falls to me. But I don't, not really. I think I stopped being only that girl a while ago, without quite noticing the moment it happened." "That's what Haven does, I think," Nana said, setting down her own work to consider the thought properly. "Gives people enough safety that they get to become someone new on top of who they already were, instead of just surviving as the same frightened version of themselves forever." It was, in its own quiet way, its own kind of victory, entirely separate from the more dramatic confrontations that had marked Haven's earlier years, the plain, steady proof that what Izuku had built here did not depend on his own presence to function, that it had grown strong and capable enough to run smoothly even with its founder 2 weeks distant on a journey toward a fourth stone not yet fully found. When Izuku's own letters finally arrived, cautious and hopeful in equal measure, describing the provincial capital and the careful work of confirming whether the family Nana's network had identified was truly the one they sought, Rei read them by the same lamplight with a steady, settled confidence that would have seemed impossible to the frightened girl she had once been, certain now, in a way she had not always been before, that whatever Izuku found at the end of that eastern road, Haven itself would still be standing strong and ready to welcome one more name home. The road ahead. The eastern road stretched on before them, quiet and golden with the last of autumn's light, and Izuku found himself, walking beside Mitsuki's steady, determined pace, reflecting on how much this journey already felt different from the ones that had come before it. He was not walking into the unknown entirely alone this time, carrying the whole weight of a stranger's fate on his own uncertain shoulders. He was walking beside someone who had once been exactly the kind of name he searched for, a girl rescued who had grown, in 3 short years, into someone capable of rescuing others in her own right, her fierce, hard-won courage every bit as valuable to this journey as his own borrowed knowledge of a future only he could see. "Whatever we find in that provincial capital," Mitsuki said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "we'll handle it the way we've handled everything else. Together, and without apology for wanting better for someone who never got a say in her own future." "Together," Izuku agreed, and felt the word settle into him with the same quiet certainty Rei had asked of him weeks before, no longer a solitary burden but a shared, steady promise, carried now by 4 founders and a growing household of nearly 30 people, all of them bent toward the same patient, stubborn work of proving that history did not have to repeat its oldest cruelties simply because no one had ever tried to stop it before,